let's crack on. I'm going to ask Ozu, our committee clerk, to just take us through the business of the day so that we can really focus this meeting on the main agenda item, which is on the London Plan consultation draft. Ozu.
I've got apologies from Assembly Member Buff, for whom Assembly Member Abel will be substituting. Assembly Member Berry is in attendance as an observer and can participate in the main business of the committee today on the London Plan. Declarations of interest. Just need to ask if members members to note the list of offices held by Assembly members and to ask if there are any additional declarations of interest.
Are there any? No.
Okay. And can I also ask members to confirm the minutes of the last meeting held on the 7th of September 2017?
Agreed.
A summary list of actions. Can members note the ongoing and completed actions highlighted on agenda item 4?
Noted.
An action taken on the delegated authority. Can members note the action taken by the chair on the delegated authority as set out in the report?
Noted.
And now we've come to the main item.
If you just do the other items and then we can come back to the main item and
Okay.
go on like to the end.
And this is item 7, the rapporteur reports, design, sale, delivered, the contribution of off-site manufactured homes to solving London's housing crisis. And just asking members to note the final report, which is attached at Appendix 1.
Noted.
Okay, and then the committee work programme. And can I ask members to note the progress on the work programme, to note the main agenda item for the committee's meeting on the 30th of January 2018, which will be on the London Plan consultation, and to delegate authority to the chair in consultation with the deputy chair to agree the subject, scope, and terms of reference for the main agenda item for the committee's meetings on 28th of February and 14th of March 2018.
Noted.
And just to note that the next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Tuesday, 30th of January 2018.
Thank you. Yeah.
Now go back to the main agenda item 6.
I'll read that.
Okay. And the main agenda item today is discussion and the mayoral consultation on the draft London Plan 2017. And
I think that's great. I'll go on with that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ozu. Now, as you heard from Ozu, our main agenda item is that it's the first of 2 meetings. The next one is tomorrow week, Tuesday, the 30th of January, in the morning. And these 2 meetings are to help the Planning Committee shape its response to the Mayor's new London Plan, which is a consultation draft, which will then be submitted to both the Mayor, and then go forward to an examination in public later in the year, led by a government inspector. Now, if any of you who are looking at this on the webcast want to respond, and we would want to encourage you to respond, then I'm just going to refer to Reece, who's going to tell you exactly how you can do that.
So you can respond to the London Plan directly, and you can comment directly on its section at london.gov.uk. Click Planning, London Plan, New London Plan, and you'll be able to comment there. You can also email the Planning Committee to respond to our response to the consultation at planningcommittee@london.gov.uk.
Fine, thank you very much for that, and we would encourage you. I just want to say one thing to those who are listening and watching, which is that the London Plan is a very large 500-page document, and in fact it has policy boxes in it. And if you want to make a substantial change, if you want to make a change, then you have to remember that it's the policies that you have to concentrate on. If there's something in the supplementary text, then that has to be, if you want to see it as policy, then you've got to say so and put it in the policy box. I hope that's clear. Maybe things will become even clearer after we've had this meeting. We are responding, the Planning Committee, on behalf of the Assembly. Other committees are looking at other parts of the plan, but we will be putting in a response on behalf of all the committees and all the Assembly. Now, today we're focusing on the density framework. You know, how is London going to grow? For whom is it going to grow? Where is it going to grow? Really those big questions. But we're particularly looking at the how development is going to be directed, where to, and how dense, and what is the role of design, because this plan puts a huge emphasis on design, which is very welcome. And also some of the other big issues, like the presumption in favour of small sites, and what's about London's skyline. So we have a very good panel here, and we also have two people who are going to join us for particular questions, Finn Williams and Elspeth Clements. Now, if my panel would introduce themselves, and then we'll get cracking on questions. Would you like to start?
Right. Sorry, I've been parachuted into this. I'm an architect, and I started my career out working for the GLC Architects Department, so I've actually had 45 years working in housing. I was most notably job architect on their pilot participation scheme, Swinbrook Road housing scheme. Since then, I've been principal of my own smallish architectural practice, and we've dealt mainly with housing, and largely with housing private developers. Although I've also worked quite considerably with housing associations when I could. Unfortunately, the current procurement methods mean that my practice
this is just an introduction.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted...
2 lines.
Oh, 2 lines. Well, I'm Elspeth Clements, I'm an architect. I'm also chairman of the Highgate Society.
Yeah, so you wear 2 hats. You're an architect, and you also work at as part of the, one of the organisations,
and
part of the London Forum.
Localism.
That's lovely, thank
Sorry.
you. Sorry, it's my fault.
Finn Williams, Chief Executive Officer of Public Practice, which is a new social enterprise placing design expertise in local government.
Rosemary McQueen, I trained in, my first degree was sociology, I then did planning, did architecture. Sorry, sorry about that. My name is Rosemary McQueen. My first degree was in sociology. I've also trained as a chartered town planner. I'm also a chartered surveyor. I trained in architecture, although I didn't finish my professional practice, architectural conservation, and finally management. So those are the kind of backgrounds to perhaps the way I think. My last job was as strategic director for built environment for Westminster City Council. From university days, based in London. My entire career has been based in London. I have worked at other local authorities. I worked in the private sector to begin with, worked in Lewisham, in Southwark.
Thank you.
And Hackney as well.
You're all here because you're so expert. It's all right. Okay.
My name is Sunand Prasad. I'm an architect. I have practiced in London for 25, 30, 40 years. I can't remember now. And I was president of the RIBA 10 years ago and have been involved as a mayor's design advisor and now a design advocate. And I've been involved with the London mayor for now 9 years and was involved in producing some of the work with the GLA team here that led up to some of the recommendations in the plan.
And you're one of the mayor's design champions. Yes.
One of my design advocates, that's right.
Oh, advocates, okay, advocates.
My name is Michael Bach. I used to plan for England, mainly planning policy on the location of development, housing and town centres. I'm chair of the Planning and Environment and Transport Committee of the London Forum. I should say in my previous life I helped commission the density matrix. And that's probably enough to begin with.
Thank you very much. Now, for the audience, we also have the mighty planning team led by Jules Pipe. And if you'd like to just introduce yourselves.
Jules Pipe, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills.
I'm Rachel Rooney, I'm one of the strategic planning managers at the London Plan team.
I'm Elliot Kemp, I'm a Principal Strategic Planner in the London Plan team.
I'm Andrew Russell, I'm a Senior Strategic Planner in the London Plan team.
Thank you. So we're very lucky. So we've got all the right people, I think, in the room. But that's no substitute for all sorts of other perspectives and views coming in by joining in the consultation. Now, I just want to explain to members that Elspeth and Finn are answering particular questions, and I'll be bringing them in. Most of the questions are to be directed towards, of course, Jules and the planning team, and the four members at the end. Nicholas has come now. Wait a minute.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Nicholas, could you just very briefly, because you've attended our investigations before, just very 2 sentences, tell us who you are.
My name is Nicholas Boyce-Smith, and I'm the founding director of Create Streets. We do research into associations between built form, well-being and sustainability, and work with communities and landowners to get development that fits those criteria.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'll open with the first question. I just want to say to all of us, we have got to be as tight and succinct as we can be, because we really want to get as much as possible covered. And we're not doing the whole thing today. We're focusing on particular policies in this plan. So it's very, very focused, and I don't apologise for the fact that it will be, at many times, pretty technical. So bear with us, but that's what... It's a regulatory document, it's legal. It has to be technical. Right, well, to begin with, I just want to ask Jules about the vision and the way, in a sense, the evidence and the intellectual justification, this is at the opening, talking about chapter 1, that's there to, in fact, that lies behind, really, the good growth policies.
Well, I think the first chapter of the plan outlines what those good growth policies are, and draws on our current experience of London in their formation. I mean, we know that London's population growth is huge ahead of us, more than 70,000 new people a year living in London. We're going to be at 10.5 million residents by 2041. And growth to respond to that population increase, both in terms of places to live, places to work, can't be left to market forces and just happen where it will. We've seen perhaps too much in the past of large, tall, dormitory-style approaches, hoping for tube extensions and new expensive bits of kit to rush people into the central activity zone as if that is a model, a sustainable model. The plan itself is about creating communities across the whole of London, not just in the central activity zone, but inner London and outer London equally, and creating vibrant town centres around which people can both live and work, as well as other things, shop, leisure activities. And if I was to say what the single driving point is, a couple of points about good growth. It's, as I say, it's about intervening to shape the growth for the better, rather than leaving it to the market, as I said, and shaping it to ensure that people have the facilities, the amenity to be able to thrive and succeed. And so whether that's heavy infrastructure, such as transport, whether it's social infrastructure, like schools, the top of the list, obviously, though, is an affordable home.
Fine. Okay. What I just want to say, just comparing it with the two previous plans, it's, if I'm right, I mean, the good growth policies, which are absolutely key for this document, and a very good set of policies, are later, a little later on, called strategic objectives, or objectives. And underneath the good growth policies, it says these amount to a vision. But if somebody asks me, what is a vision? I find it quite difficult to say. And I just want to say that to you, because it's... normally one should be able to say a vision fairly succinctly. You said something there, but it's not exactly what's in the plan. And the other thing is that I would say that one's policies come from drivers of change, or what you would call challenges in this plan. And there's a set of challenges in the foreword, there's a set of challenges in the opening chapter. They're not exactly the same or united. And personally, I would like to see the challenges set out, and the fact you mentioned that for the foreword, the Mayor mentions the strategic objectives, in a sense, that underpin the whole of the GLA, which are in the Act, which are, to promote the economic development of London and Londoners, to promote the social improvement of London and Londoners, and to improve the environment and do it in a way which helps health, inequalities, and belt and braces, is integrated and balanced over time, so you get sustainable development. Now that is what the Act says, more or less paraphrased. And I frankly think it would be even better, the opening chapter, which has a lot to commend it, I think, if it actually set out the challenges. These are the underpinning strategic objectives, and this is how we're going to address them with these policies. And then somehow it gives a context for your good growth policies.
I mean, the vision is creating a city that's socially, spatially, and economically inclusive, where we can bring out the best of existing places and bring benefits to the communities that are already there. And on page 11, even just the list of the, I'm a bit puzzled because even just the list of the good growth policies there kind of it responds to those challenges that you outline. I mean, building strong and inclusive communities, making the best use of land, creating a healthy city, delivering the homes Londoners need, growing a good economy, increasing efficiency and resilience of the city. And it says it up front there. So I would be interested to know how much further you want us to go in, because those are the headlines, and then obviously there's another 500 pages of detail behind those headlines.
Yeah, I get it. It's just somehow when you're trying to gather it together to tell other people, I can explain it. But I just wonder now what other people, if there are any other comments on, the vision isn't exactly spelt out. You've got the good growth policies which amount to a vision. But I mean, we've heard, it's just having the words which are not different people's interpretation, but I'd like to know what anyone here says about the vision, what they understand by the vision. And if people don't want to say anything, don't say anything. Devonish. Yes?
Jules, I know it's the hardest question always to ask, but if you are not talking to people in the industry, but you're on the Clapham Omnibus, in 10 years' time, what's the big difference from this document compared to what the industry and the past GLA have done? Give me one or two. This is where we are now. We'll be there. Sorry, it's a horrible question, I know.
No, I'm comfortable with it, but at risk of repeating myself, I suppose that the back of the postage stamp in a nutshell version is directing growth so that people's social needs are addressed, and that we're building a more sustainable approach to how we operate as a city. So, and it's hard to. I think the easiest way to do it is to compare intervention with non-intervention. Sort of the just let things happen would see, I believe, large housing developments. And exclusively housing, pushing everything else out, industrial workspaces, waste sites, rushing ahead without being limited temporarily to allow transport to catch up. There are areas of London that could let rip, and actually we need to harvest the land value increase to enable bits of transport kit to be built. But that's not about creating dormitories that then people can just travel into London on Crossrail 2 or whatever. It actually should be those bits of kit are there to make this more distributed approach work. And those people living in those distributed places, as I say, wouldn't just be dormitories. They would have employment opportunities locally, and social infrastructure has been secured as well. And the big question mark there is how is all that funded, because not all of this can be funded through simply a tax on development, because you pull one end, or you push one end, it pushes out the other, and then the more that we take for social infrastructure and transport, the less there is for affordable housing. So there is a chapter there posing that point about the necessity for finding the funding for the kit necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I bring Sunand in?
Hello. Every design advocate was asked to tweet in the days when it was still only 140 characters what good growth meant to them. And I think this is a really interesting exercise. And I wrote, good growth helps a city, its people, communities, places, economy, its creative, all to flourish, confident about the future. And I think that the point about the guy on or the woman on the Clapham omnibus, my test would be, do they feel confident, more confident about the future? Do they think that they're living in a city that is going to make their future better? I think everything else is underneath that, to my mind. And good growth, in comparison with the previous plans, this plan actually very frontally acknowledges that growth is inevitable in London, at least in the near and the middle term. We don't know longer than that. And how can we manage it so that it doesn't choke itself, that the very thing that makes London London and makes it grow the way it is isn't going to be choked off by that growth. And with the exception of the lack of emphasis on sustainability and the recognition of climate change, I think that that's a pretty good summary.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in? Michael Barr?
Yes.
You don't have to. It's only if you want to come in on this.
I do want to say something here. I quite like the 6 principles. They've still got some tweaking to be done to actually bring in some of the things that you've got in your policies, and also to change some of the sequencing, particularly when it comes to where do we put development. What I do like is the values-driven approach that's in there is not so much a technocratic document as the previous ones, and it does get to grips with some of those things. And I think particularly if you compare the last one, what it said about communities, it had a nice headline with lots of nice adjectives, yes. It wasn't quite strong and stable, but it was something like that. And yet it didn't produce anything. It just said we have to make lifetime neighbourhoods, which is just about housing. And nothing about building successful neighbourhoods. And that's what I like in this one. That some of that's still got to be bound together to make it work. The question that I would ask you is a bit like Tony Devonsh's question, and it's the question that you may remember that Peter Everston and I posed to you and to James. Looking back in 15 years' time, will you be proud of what you've done in terms of the kind of London that Londoners want? And that's said in the context of an overhang of 450 buildings from the last administration that impinge upon communities in a way that they're unfamiliar with and would have preferred it to come in some other form. Will you be actually able to deliver the kind of communities and the kind of context that Londoners will thank you for?
I think I will if this blueprint is followed, because that's what it is. It is a blueprint for how it can be done. And I come back to my earlier point about the funding, and that if we can't either get devolution, fiscal devolution, or if the government alternatively doesn't step back into the space of subsidising infrastructure and social infrastructure to levels that was previously or approaching those levels, if all we're left with is trying to tax developments to deliver all of this, then no, I don't think we will deliver it. But as I say, it's a blueprint to show how it can be done and how we think growth can be handled well, including a chapter how what we think needs to be funded to be able to deliver this.
But it is the issue of the densities and the type of development. And I think we were particularly sensitive where the mayor in A City for All Londoners had been very clear that Londoners ought to feel comfortable with the change. And I don't find that in here. The stuff on tall buildings, for example, is all technical.
Going to come to that, Michael.
Yes, no, I don't want you to go in there.
Okay, no, I'm happy to come back to that in that section.
We are going to come on to some of these other issues.
No,
Nicholas.
Just on the intellectual justification, I mean, you know, as ever in these sessions, you focus on things you don't quite like, so apologies in advance. I think there's a lot of really good stuff in here, and you know, the good growth chapter, in a way, I don't disagree with a word of it. I think the problem is what isn't there, and I think there are probably two types of that. And the first is, and there's a key paragraph I pulled out here that there are others have probably said of, paragraph 1.2.3, which involves good growth 2. And you put there, completely correctly, the justifications for increased density. And there are good justifications for increased density. It's more walkable, people have better physical health, you know, all sorts of good things about that. But there are also, and you can see this in both the well-being data and then the value research, there are good things about low density. You get more personal space, you get personal garden, people put a huge value on that, you can find that. And so we make the case, and I think empirically make the case, that gentle density, as we call it, I wouldn't say you can have your cake and eat it, because that would be naive, but that you can, in the right circumstances, when it's well designed with clear street pattern, clear backs, clear fronts, get some of the advantages of high density and some of the advantages of lower density. And I think what I found intellectually missing in chapter 1 was that recognition of that inescapable tension. Wherever you think we should be on that curve, that tension is there. And I thought that, you know, the other side of the coin, and that those things have to be traded off, which they do, and your job is to trade them off, I think wasn't there. And I think that's important for what, you know, follows then from the London plan. But the second thing, which I thought wasn't quite there, though again this was perhaps more implicit, and was certainly then implicit in the chapter, the next chapter where you looked at opportunity areas. I mean, we certainly find we put about 2/3 of our work is with community groups as opposed to with landowners or investors. And we find when we talk in this type of language, you know, people look at us and say, well, what the flippity gibbets are you talking about? And you need to get tangible. You need to get real. You need to say, in fact, we're doing a session tomorrow on this. Well, that means this. That means it's going to be this high, the block structure is going to be this, the facading pattern is going to be this, this split between public and private land. And certainly what we're hearing from some of the boroughs in response to this, you may be hearing differently, is that they worry about the certainty in this and what it will actually mean. And you're right, so you're setting out a blueprint, and fine, you can't define everything. But I think, and you rightly in that section on small sites, which we'll come to, get into design code territory. And I think that's the right intellectual jump. But I think the key point that needs remembering, in historic and comparative terms, the British planning system is very strange. It has a point of view on almost everything, but actually certainty on almost nothing. It's a policy-led approach rather than a regulatory-led approach. Now, you can't fix that completely, but I think if you're able to push yourself and be clearer and actually more ambitious about what that means. So give it a name, give it a physical, tangible reality that the Londoners can get their hands around. You know, you talk about expansion of the Thames estuary, right? Thames towns, you know, a network of mixed-use, high-density towns, respecting the local vernacular, but also moving it forward. You know, Elizabeth towns, to follow on to the Elizabeth line. You know, I think there's a range of things there that could really bring it to life. It could actually, you know, the vision is there, but I think it's sometimes struggling to get out. And I think there are 4 or 5 ways in which you could really bring it to life and, you know, get it from page 15 of the Evening Standard onto page 1 of the Evening Standard, where it should be, because it is of that level of importance.
I want to close down. I mean, are you burning to say something, Elizabeth?
It's just one tiny point.
Yeah, okay, tiny point.
D1B1, you mentioned local context. Nicholas has mentioned design codes, which...
We're coming on to all this later.
Oh, right, okay. Well, I won't say anything more then.
No, honestly, we're coming on to all this. I wanted us to stick to the broad outlines of the vision, whether somebody actually could go out and tell somebody what the vision is, apart from it's about good growth. You know, you've got to say something explanatory. Whether people understand why we're going for higher density and what that means and how it's good in terms of shared resources, some kind of evidence and intellectual justification. Why is climate change so important? Why is inequality so... Anyway, I've said it. I just think it could be, I don't know, teed up a bit, I think. Anyway, if we could now go to question 2, and Tony Harper's coming in on this one.
Yes, these questions really are all addressed to Jules. Would it be fair to, and I want to roll in, of the 2 specific areas, which I think you understand, I want to roll in P-towels with density. As far as this is
P-towels is question 8.
Yeah.
Question 8?
Is it?
Yes, P-towels is question 8.
The
first question...
I don't know, I mean, I hope...
Got the question.
Well, they know what P-towels are.
Yeah, you know anyway.
I didn't know what question 8 was.
Question 8 relates to P-towels. A very simple question. I ask this as a layman. Would it be fair to say, Jules, that one of the principal changes in emphasis in the new London plan has moved from building on brownland sites to small backland development sites?
No, I think it's added those sites to the brownfield sites.
Well, I ask you because you have...
And sorry, and a lot of those backland sites and things and small sites will be brownfield sites.
Well, you see, I ask because you use the phrase in the plan that there will be no net loss of floor space on strategic industrial land. Okay? If there is no loss, that suggests that there will be no building on industrial land, and for you to accommodate your housing targets, you have to use some other kind of land, and therefore, is that new land going to be garden and small open space?
Yeah. No, definitely not. We would welcome people bringing forward development proposals for industrial land of all sorts, if in those proposals they are seeking to preserve the floor space, which is different from footprint. So if I take it, so on say locally designated industrial land, they would usually be sites that don't necessarily have yard space. They are 1960s, plenty of that around, 2-storey light industrial space. If someone was proposing to redevelop that, again, as 2 floors of maker space, preserving the, not just flipping it through PD rights into badly made residential, but actually redeveloping the site to preserve the amount of floor space and then put a couple of office stories of office above and a couple of stories of residential, if it worked within the context that that building is in, we would welcome that. On strategic industrial land, much heavier uses, say logistics, what we would welcome is if someone, as a couple of firms are looking at, about double and treble decking the logistics space, and they would be freeing up.
You're talking about, instead of having single-storey industrial property, you're looking for multi-storey.
That's right. And if you look at, sorry, I don't want to mention brand names, but DIY, big DIY stores that have kind of very high ceiling single-storey properties, they're beginning to look at new models now where they take a more high street approach. Freeing up that land would see a far more productive use of it than the single-storey shed with a large car park outside.
But the simple answer to my question is that there, in effect, is going to be no loss of industrial floor space as opposed to footprint.
That's right.
Okay. Now the second question again relates to this. You say that one of the ways in which you're going to increase density is in relation to small sites. And some of the things that you define as small sites are residential conversions, demolition and development of existing building.
Tony, with respect.
No, please. These are questions on density. I have to tell you, Jules, and I know that you must already know this because of submissions from some local planning authorities. Those of us who represent Outer London, as I do, see this as an attack, really, on our environment. We have very little industrial space in the boroughs that I represent, certainly in 2 of the boroughs that I represent, but we have a lot of large gardens. And the clear inference is that, for example, in the London Borough of Richmond, we're going to be punished because we don't have the brownland development there, and the character of our borough is related to relatively large gardens, and this is seen as an attack on that. Can you defend that?
Yeah, I don't think it is an attack on gardens, and it's certainly not about garden grabbing. It's about taking a different approach, particularly to development sites that already come forward. You see, for a start, that policy is aimed at sort of space that's within 800 metres, typically, of a town centre. So it's not out and out suburbia. sites, say behind high streets, where a petrol station will be, where a supermarket closes, instead, and these things happen all the time as we see those applications come forward. Instead, what this plan does, it encourages a different tack to be taken. That instead of the default being a series of semi-detached houses with space for 3 or 4 cars in a driveway being built on such a site and ending up with 4 large units, instead we'd suggest, the plan suggests taking the approach of, say, a mansion block, still only 2-3 stories, of flats, in which case you would end up with 9-12 homes instead of 3 or 4. So at a stroke, you've doubled or trebled the housing density without, no one's even mentioned a garden there. Similarly, on subdivision within large houses, it's very common in inner London that already dense housing, Victorian terraces, is split into flats. And this goes on at a far faster rate in inner London than it does in outer London. And if there was some more subdivision in outer London that goes on in inner London, again, this would not materially change, it certainly wouldn't involve any garden grabbing, and it doesn't materially change the streetscape. So no one's, as I say, it isn't an attack on the suburbs as you suggest.
Well, you say that, Jules. In effect, what you are describing, if you like, is open season for house builders to come in, acquire large houses. I think you used the phrase large houses, knock them down. Where there may have been, and I think you said yourself, there may have only been 2 large houses, and in effect you replace them with 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever there may be. That's fair, isn't it? Isn't that what you have just said?
Well, I don't think it makes that any more likely than it's happened before. I'm talking about sort of say the sites that come up regularly, far more frequently come up for development, such as.
The petrol stations, by and large, have long gone, Jules. You know that.
There are plenty of big shed, big box retail sites as well, and there are plenty of those in outer London, which are very poor uses of space.
Well, I would say to you, not in my London, and I'm glad to say that you have.
And that's probably why the Richmond targets are lower than many other. Many other borough targets.
Well, the Richmond targets are low because it physically can't be done, because we've got the river on one side and the Royal Parks on the other. So there's
so they are lower targets.
In fact, it's not, because your policies are London-wide. For example, the PTAL policy, the 800 metres thing, it's the same whether it's in inner London or outer London that you're asking for these increased densities. I'll put it to you, Jules, and this is something you have suggested, that if you are close to a station, within 800 metres of a station, in effect you're going to be in a very urban situation like downtown. I would suggest to you that in outer London that isn't the case. Many stations that we have in outer London, for example Hampton Station, Teddington Station, places on the Kingston Loop, they have very poor other forms of transport to get to the stations. 800 metres, for example, of Teddington Station would mean that you take parts of a golf course, you would take parts of a royal park, and things of that sort. So far as I can see, and so far as my officers can see in the boroughs, you haven't taken that into account. Are you going to have, please let me make the point, are you going to allow exceptions within the 800 metres to take into account the actual physical surroundings of these stations?
Right, at this point, I want to go back. I mean, first of all, I'm not stopping you. I'm not stopping you. I'm helping you. Who's chairing this meeting? I want to just bring in Elspeth on your point about large gardens, and then I want to bring in Jules back on the 800 metres. But just on the large gardens, You made a point to me some other ages ago about curtilage. Oh, is it rosemary? Maybe it's rosemary.
I was actually going to add an addendum, which is a slightly different kind of location, but if you think of all the problems that we've had over the last decade or more of beds and sheds, my concern when I read this 800-metre thing was how are your policies actually going to deal with the issue of unauthorised development that's still sitting there, bungalow-type sheds in back gardens, where the standards for those are just, I think it's 6 square metres if it's a one bed. So are we actually turning on its head and now saying beds and sheds are actually rather a kind of attractive, could be beneficial to London? Because there is an issue there in relation to gardens being taken away.
Yes.
And many of those sheds at the back are accessible by small sort of little rutted tracks to them, and I think there's just a danger that some people might think that this is a sanctioning of them being permanent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is, quite the reverse. I mean, I think beds and sheds get encouraged by the fact that PD rights allow people just to build something, an outhouse at the end of their garden, and they're absolutely entitled to under PD rights. They build something that isn't meant to be inhabited.
Only extension, not separate dwellings.
Well, nevertheless, it can be adjacent. It can be adjacent to the house.
Extension.
And those can end up being used unchecked, and it will rely on enforcement. Under this policy, it would require planning permission. Creating an additional dwelling. And it requires mitigation so for example, I'll give you as an example, if someone was subdividing a house, not demolishing it, simply subdividing a house, but to enable there to be a bathroom and kitchen for each of the flats across the 2 floors, it meant that there had to be a small extension into the garden. Unlike PD rights, this, because it's creating a new unit, this would require planning permission, and under this plan, that planning permission would require mitigation. So whether that was, if there was car parking space out the front, it was given over to green space, or whether it required a green roof, or whether it required the demolition of something else in the ground to enable that to be greened instead, or failing all of that, a payment has to be made for additional greening such as street trees. So this actually requires mitigation, and it's done in through an application. So I don't think it is encouraging anybody to go down a kind of a laissez-faire, let's throw something up and go down the beds and sheds route. On Tony's point about exemptions, did you want me to answer that bit on exemptions? Effectively there are, because it's clear in the plan that there isn't just one criterion. You have to be 800 metres within a town centre at all. It requires that a design-led approach is taken, that context is taken into account, so the particular location, whether it's suitable. The capacity not only for transport but other local infrastructure. So if nothing else is nearby, it's just a station pretty much out on its own, that wouldn't seem to tick that box. Plus, another one would be conservation areas. It specifically says in there that other rules would apply for. It will be subject to the rules around conservation areas as well. And I would imagine that probably conservation areas cover quite an awful lot of areas that you're talking about.
It is significant, George. I think. Are you saying to us now, when you're because as far as I can see, you're sort of praying in aid existing permitted development, which you're suggesting encourages beds and sheds. Are you saying that that's all going to be swept away and replaced by the London plan?
No, because it's in the NPPF. It's above the London.
And the other point that you're making about subdivision, my understanding is that new rules are going to be implemented in relation to HMOs, which are completely separate from any of this. Isn't that right?
Are those planning rules? I'm not aware of.
Houses in multiple
occupancy. No, I know what HMOs are.
You talked about the point. Oh, you just chuck in a bathroom and the rest of it, and that's going to be an extra unit.
No. I said no. I specifically said if you subdivided a house into 2 flats and you needed to make alterations at the back to ensure that each floor had a kitchen and bathroom, so it might need a kind of a small extension at the back to ensure that each floor had kitchen and bathroom facilities, but it would be a separate entrance, for example, a separate entrance to each. I'm talking about properly subdivided, the creation of 2 flats out of one house, which is a very, very common thing that happens in inner London.
Are you saying actually that you can have a, I think I've read this, that you can have a side extension, which as long as it's a separate household, can exist? Have I got this right?
I don't know, getting into local planning. Andrew?
No.
In terms of the policy, I don't know if I can shed light on it. All space standards apply to the presumption in favour of development. What it's trying to do is ensure that you get net additional units provided from this type of development that happens already under permitted development rights. But with permitted development rights, you don't get any additional homes. So it's applying the same sort of wriggle room that applies to that type of development, but requires, in doing so, that you actually get new homes provided, and those new homes meet our current space standards, which isn't the case under permitted development rights.
And mitigate any green loss.
And full mitigation of any loss of green space. So it's trying to put into place something that's plan-led, whereas things like beds and sheds, as we've heard, happen because of an absence of planning and London's lack of stock to meet the housing demand that's in those places. So this is really the opposite of things like beds and sheds. It's seeking to have a far more efficient plan-led approach that's also takes into account design quality and ensures all the homes are of minimum space standards.
Well, it does, except that the detail of what's in the pink box in relation to conservation areas, you then relate to the reason justification as well. And it's very clear that, in a sense, it's like there's a subsidiary order. The most important is delivering residential units. And if you can protect the conservation area, that's okay. But in fact, that's the most important thing. And those of us that sat, being pursued by barristers in inquiries will know how that wording, the slant of the wording is, and all the way through there are kind of references to it's got to be quite a lot of change, conservation areas are going to be subject to change, etc., etc. So, and there's another place where you only list listed buildings as the heritage assets, making it very clear that, there, in fact, it's F of this bit as well. I mean, it is clear that there is a conscious intention, and I'm not denying that there are many conservation areas who can accept quite a lot of densification, providing the design is right. But the way it's worded will lead, I think, to a lot of arguments with people maintaining their design and their densification is the right one because of the need for affordable housing, when people might have actually taken a slightly softer, gentler approach, which would have been, perhaps politically and certainly in terms of the community, a more acceptable way forward.
I mean, that's a very helpful contribution. I just want to say to people, we're not following the agenda we set out, but that's okay. But I just want to say, next week, next Tuesday morning, we will have a whole session on conservation areas and heritage and so on. So I'd rather the team just took that away and we use that as a springboard for that next week. We have actually, because Tony wanted to, and it's fine, we've just been dealing with conversions, etc., gardens and so on, being part of small sites, which I was going to tackle after Jules had left, because he's the man. But he's the man. Okay. But in fact, I wanted us to really be talking about density and the role of the density matrix, or now that it's what's instead of the density matrix, and the role of design-led planning.
And I question then if it doesn't want to.
Tony has a question on this.
No.
Do you want to answer?
Tony can do that. There's
two Tonys. Which Tony is asking?
Tony Devonish will ask the specific question on density. But whilst Jules is here, can I say to you that the most concerning thing, we've looked at your maps and I take the point about conservation areas, preservation of a conservation area, is probably going to be subservient to your overall housing proposals, which relates to new development, new residential development within 800 metres, not needing a requirement for off-street parking. Can I say to you that again in the suburbs, particularly in the outer suburbs, this is going to create the most tremendous inconvenience, because it is in the outer suburbs that those bits which are closest to the stations are the bits which have parking controls of one kind or another. Manifestly, by allowing developments within that 800 metres to be built in an area where there are existing parking controls, to say that the new residents no longer need to be provided with off-street car parking, that is going to mean a requirement that there has to be controlled parking, therefore, to accommodate not just the existing residents, but the cars which come from the new residents, which my borough believes will have a very substantial impact on the environment of those areas which are indeed within 800 metres of our outer stations. Do you accept that? No, let me just ask the question. The point I'm making about the ripple effect that there will need to be on controlled parking.
The plan, in common with the drive from the transport plan and the environment plan, means that there will have to be behaviour change going forward in London. We do have to wean ourselves off cars, and if transport links are good, if it has a high PTAL, if it is within, if the accessibility to good transport is effective, there are plans to obviously increase the orbital links as well through increase of buses in London going forward. We have got to design London more about using public transport, walking and cycling whenever possible. We can't continue to design for just perpetual use of cars. If that means that car-free development ends up requiring the introduction of a CPZ, then that might be something that the local authority might have to consider. But if it's for a small development of 4 or 5 flats, I can't see that that's really going to have the kind of knock-on effect that would require the introduction of a CPZ for that reason alone.
You're just extending the thing to absurdity, because of course we know that if this comes in, it won't just be one block of 4 or 5 flats or whatever. Whilst there is going to be no requirement to provide off-street car parking, there are going to be very many more of these kinds of developments, and that's manifestly true. I think that often, and I've heard it over many years sitting in here, there isn't a proper realisation that there are very many Londons, and those of us who represent the outskirts of London, where we're fortunate to have overground stations, no underground, but overground stations, the requirements for having a motor car are completely different from inner London. And we don't believe that this proposal that you have takes that into account.
You've made that point very clearly.
Shall I move on to density?
Yes, please.
Jules, did you consider revising the current London plan policy on density, please, and what the evidence is there?
We don't think that we've revised the policy as such. We think we've gone back to the first principles that actually...
The question is, did you consider at any point revising it before actually, so to speak, abandoning it, though you've got other measures in place? Is there any evidence for that?
Yeah.
Yes.
We don't think we have abandoned it. We think we've gone back to the first principles that the matrix is built on. We just simply haven't kept a small table, the bounds of which were broken more often than they were met. So you had good policies, and which we are adhering to. But they were then, which are meant to be indicative, they're not meant to be prescriptive and set limits, they were meant to be an indicator of what should be built. You had bounds, high and low, for 3 ranges of PTAL. But more than, I think every year bar one since 2004, those, something like more than half of those applications exceeded or fell outside those bounds. So something like 50%, go back last year, 50% of applications were denser than the highest end of the range, and 15% were lower. So that left a small proportion that actually was in the range. I don't know whether Elliot wants to expand on some of the thinking behind.
Yeah, in terms of the evidence, there's 5 density reports on the website. So we did look, because of the evidence that George has set out in terms of the need to review the policy, because we weren't obviously implementing it as intended. So we looked and employed consultants to examine the history of the policy, to look at alternatives, and so we have gone through a range of sort of alternatives in the exploration in those documents, and you can read about them online.
The ones that you produced last February? No, anyway, we looked
yes,
at
so there's
because they were not actually examining the density matrix and giving evidence for how you might revise it. They were looking at.
So there's one by ARUPS, it's Density Project 4, and that looked at the history of the density matrix, it looked at the characterisation areas and different alternatives. There's also combining that with the work that LSE did, looking at density, sort of the actual outputs of density and the reasons for density, the resultant density we get in development. So it's using that information together led us to our final policy approach.
I think the point is we don't disagree with what you or Jules have said. I think if you are an industry consultant coming into this afresh, it's very confusing when you've worked traditionally in the past. Perhaps the guy's gone to Manchester and's come back, to use an example, and you used to have a matrix and now you don't. Isn't it just going to cause lack of clarity, going to cause confusion? Because not everybody will spot the ARUP report that you mentioned.
I think the idea was to sort of find what helps you deliver successful density schemes, and that's what we tried to do in the policy. That's the intention of the policy. Think about what's important, and that's what we're trying to be a bit clearer and pushing boroughs to be sort of plan-led, much clearer in terms of what form and scale of development that they're planning for, rather than leaving it to negotiations for every single application, in which there's lack of certainty, certainly for the local residents as well as the development industry.
I think the plan-led approach is very welcome, but I want to hear from Tom. You want to come in? I want to hear from some of our panel on this.
It was just so I'll try to work which way round we've got this. You know, are you scrapping the density matrix because it's just being breached time and time again? The alternative to that would be that you enforce what's there and apply it more strictly. I'm trying to work out. So are you abandoning it because it's just being flouted, and therefore, or is it just because you actually think there's a better way that you can do this? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think that just emphasises the point. It's only a starting point. It's if you just because these applications are outside the range doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means that matrix was supposed to be the starting point for a discussion around design and capacity of infrastructure. But people have used it as in you're outside, you're at the top of the range, and therefore this is too high a density. But every single site has a different context. They might have the same PTAL, that might be in an urban or suburban area, but actually there can be completely different densities on those sites. And I think the reason we've removed it is from the confusion that if you're somehow outside these ranges, that's the wrong density, and it's trying to get it back to looking at what is the actual capacity of that site and trying to get boroughs to think about, what's the capacity of, individual types of sites in their areas.
To interject though, you could have changed the range of the density if you think it's too. Yes, exactly. Okay, go on.
Sorry, no. Yes, you could have amended it. You could have made it more. You could have. Try to find the right word. Not made it more complex, but you could have made it more subtle, perhaps. I don't know.
We still have kept the upper range as an indicator for when something should undergo greater design scrutiny for the suitability of its location.
So the principle of sustainable residential quality, has that been abandoned? Is that no longer important, or are you just applying it in a different way?
Yeah, the latter.
So we did ask one of the research reports by consultants Three Dragons was looking at high density schemes and was asked the question, what would be a new density limit? What is the ultimate density limit for London? And the answer is it's not about that number, the density number, it's about the design, layout of the scheme and its management. Those are the really key things for making it successful. And so we're trying to focus a policy on those things to ensure that the development will be high quality and sustainable in the future. Whereas the number would be, it would be very difficult to come up with another number because every single time you could just justify another different density maybe for a site. So it's almost like there isn't a density number that you could give at a strategic level for all of London.
On the, I was interested in the whole management plan concept. I think it's paragraph, it's 3.6.8 sets out what you expect to be covered by a management plan. I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on if there's anything else that ought to be considered, or just thoughts on that particular proposal in general.
I'd quite like to make a response on that, because it's not the only time that there is stuff contained within here which is way outside planning's responsibility and legislatively that we would be able, when I say we, I mean the greater sort of local authorities. Good intentions, but if that was the thing that said, therefore, a series of tall buildings would be acceptable on the site, it's in a way, it's a sort of chimera. It's actually confusing the local residents that there is going to be something there which would be, monitored by planners, when in fact they can't actually be involved in that. You can ask for the material to come in, but it's not something that you can condition. And while I'm on that, I might as well say it's the same about conditioning the name of an architect to be. We tried that 15 years ago, and we were laughed out of court by the legal profession. You simply cannot do that. You can control the quality, but you can't control the name of an architect. And this is in a very similar area. And just to go back just to that point about density, I mean, it is in a sense rather depressing, it seems to me, that because a lot of people actually broke the density guidelines, primarily, of course, with tall buildings, that now we're actually changing it to, in a sense, facilitate tall buildings.
Michael.
Yes, I have to say I'm not quite sure where all this has got us to. The density matrix was meant to identify the best, most accessible locations that you could develop at higher densities. It was meant to establish the capacity of the sites, and that's in the SHLA. It's a benchmark for appropriate density range for schemes. If it's not in the plan, where is the benchmark? So I think you've just thrown the baby out with the bathwater. If you look at some of the reasons that were given, and if you've actually sort of denied some of them, all the headlines were it constrains high density development. Well, it clearly hasn't. And the other one is that it's a crude tool. Actually, it's a guide to getting you into the right ballpark. Without that ballpark in the plan, you haven't got one. You're now thrown back on whatever it is that the developer can negotiate in private, because it won't be in public, between them and the planning officers. They will be outgunned, and the community will not have a say. So
there's a gauntlet.
I would actually like to see you actually recognise some of that. As for the research, none of the research did more than suggest a few improvements. And the TfL one actually had recommendations. The PTAL should remain the key component for housing density policies that use the tool that they have, and alongside other PTAL's other factors, of course, including proximity to town centres. But the alternative, and we'll come to that, I suppose, at some stage, is that the developer goes and sits down with the planner and says, I've got a lovely scheme here, perfectly designed, fits in, you don't have to worry about the density. And we're going to get quite a lot of development that communities are going to feel uncomfortable with. A, because they had no say, and B, because of what it is. And I think you've got to recognise that unless you give a ballpark to start with, and people can see what's outside the range, you'll always be over the range, but the range won't exist.
If I may, there's an important follow-on from that. I assume I'm right in assuming that a lot of the land speculation leading to high land values and therefore required high densities to make it get deliverable is not something you in every case want to see, and I'd strongly passionately agree with the case for appropriate densification in some suburban areas. But I think if you're not setting clarity on what is acceptable as an upper limit, and certainly the lawyers I've spoken to, I've not, like Rosemary, sat on the receiving end of it, but I have spoken to a few lawyers about this, and certainly what I'm hearing, and I may be wrong, is that yes, this will allow for greater density development in outer areas. In some cases that would be a good thing, but if there isn't a clear limit on it, the land value won't be set. And with the viability regime as it currently works, which none of us around this table can change, I think the pressure that will lead to, well, I've paid this, therefore if you want a policy compliant 35 to 50% level of affordable housing, which is a good thing, therefore it's going to have to be this, and mathematically they'll be right. And I think that's and so I think, as we saw, I think in the earlier conversations between Deputy Mayor and Mr Arbour, this tension of the urbanisation of the suburbs, whatever you think of it, is going to be a key theme that runs through the consequences of this. So I think giving communities, and I'll tell you, I'd be pro densifying some suburban areas. I think you're setting the right policy there, but doing it in a way where communities have clarity, both in terms of affordable housing and in terms of height, and in terms of urban grey, and in terms of density and facading. I think that will make your job a lot easier. And if I may just one final thing, then I'll be quiet, is there are other ratios, I mean, without even going back to density metrics, there are other ways you define how a town or a city works. The height of a street versus the width of the street, the width of the blocks, the proportion of private land versus public land, and all of those things. I'm not saying you want to necessarily put a number in them in the London plan at your level, but setting out that those are important. It's implicit in a couple of places. I would argue is something that would allow some of Tony's voters to get comfortable about some of the densification that might be coming down the line.
Sorry, Nick, and I think Nicholas is absolutely right in those latter things about what determines it, more alongside the fact that planning authorities should be proactively planning the capacity for particular areas. That should be the driver rather than simply a chart that says 3 bands to cater for the whole of London.
They are quite wide bands to build within.
Chair, I'd be keen to get particularly a response on the land value issue, because I mean, did you take into account the fact that removing the density matrix might lead to an increase in land value, and how are you going to mitigate that?
Rachel, did you want to?
Well, I mean, in respect, obviously this first time round we're doing a viability study of the plan, which is obviously once we get through the IP, we'll say that all those policies, in the round are viable. So if a developer comes in and says, you can have this or you can have that, we won't be having those kind of conversations with them anymore, apart from obviously there will be some exceptional circumstances. So I think that's the first point. And then you've still got the whole area about, okay, well that might be really tall buildings if you're going to do all this, but the whole design-led approach, the design scrutiny should hopefully, and the context of the site will bring that down. So it'll still be their choice about how much they pay for those lands, but they'll know, particularly with the viability of the plan, that it's not a negotiation of policies trading off with each other.
I think there's something underlying the whole of this that I think we should acknowledge, which is that this plan, this London plan, is an attempt to move very firmly to a plan-led approach to development control, rather than a development control-led approach to planning. And that underlies it, but it's actually a bit half-baked, because that's actually a very difficult transition to make, and nobody's yet worked out how properly to do it. Boroughs certainly don't have the capacity to make the judgments, because when you move to a plan-led approach, there's an enormous amount of judgment and local judgment involved. Involvement of local people, it's all fantastic in theory. There's no, I'm completely with it. And I think that a lot of us have been arguing for a long time for a planning system that is more plan-led and less site-by-site. But if you suddenly say, that's it, then it's open season for all sorts of people who will exploit that loophole. So I don't think we have a transition here. We're suddenly going from a relatively kind of secure degree of prescription. Actually, it wasn't that secure anyway, but a flaunted degree of prescription to potentially removing all prescription and saying, very, very noble intention, you decide, boroughs, you decide what it's going to be like, and we'll go for it. But they can't do it yet. Despite public practice and Finn's efforts, that's going to only scratch the surface. And I think that this is a gaping hole in the plan, actually.
Can I just come in here? Can I just say, Jules, because I think we need to have the argument against what we've just been hearing, because you're moving to a plan-led approach, that's approved of. It's going to be a difficult transition, but you said yourself you haven't scrapped the density matrix. You've just gone back to first principles, put other things in place. I think we ought to probe how much what you put in place will do the job. I mean, the idea of boroughs dividing themselves, I think I've got this right, that areas of boroughs will have their own density frameworks, that you're replacing that range. But then I think then we have to examine whether that's really going to do the job, and then their area codes and so on. You're trying to put some sort of benchmarks and caveats in. Can you tell us about those? What's there instead of the density matrix?
Well, one of the things that we'll be bringing forward that we've already flagged up is the Housing Design Guide, SDG. So that would go into detail about what some of these things would look like, and I think it will go actually slightly beyond housing, because of course it takes in the context that it's within, and also building above, say some of the things I've suggested that could be built above. So I think it will go wider than simply domestic typologies, so that would be one of the weapons in our arsenal about tempering this tendency that has been spoken about to sort of just let rip at the highest possible density. I think there are a lot of constraints that can be put in place. As I say, the capacity described by for a place described by the local authority, the design guidance, the local context that a place is in. Proximity to transport, proximity to other amenities, all these things we would be expected to be taken into account. I think it's absolutely correct to say, though, that there is a capacity issue of local authority. But I think there is now in taking a development control approach as well. I think local authorities need to be invested in, and that's not a criticism of local authorities because they haven't got the money to invest in them. It's something that the government has got to address. One of them is the fact that, but one way of doing it is the fact that we would charge more for larger planning applications, and boroughs have consistently asked for this, and developers have consistently said yes, they'd be willing. But time and time again, the government has refused to do this because they think it's going to be some sort of constraint on development.
The density range provides that kind of guidance to boroughs, and it goes.
On this point,
what do they put in its place?
Well, the fact that it's not regulatory,
doesn't matter.
So it's simply guidance. I struggle with the notion that between a local authority and a developer, they wouldn't come to a particular figure, what would be right based on the list of things that we've talked about, and instead default to simply a simple matrix.
No, it's not default,
surely it's got to be more complicated than that, or rather more individual, more bespoke for an area than simply...
Jules, you've actually said that boroughs have to decide area by area of their boroughs what the density range is going to be. And you said it's by, we don't like this, by the way, you've said it's by units. And we would rather it was by habitable rooms or bedroom spaces, or bed spaces even, because we think units will lead to lots, but it's another talk, lead to lots and lots of one-bed flats. But nevertheless, you've got a density range there. How are the boroughs going to do it? At what stage?
Well, this is the comprehensive assessment of capacity for growth, isn't it? Yeah. How do you envisage them doing that? How will that take place?
Policy D2 and Part A and B sort of set out those processes, so the evidence gathering and then the processes for working out capacity. Now, boroughs do this where they have their site allocations already. We'll have design codes maybe for smaller sites. It's that process that they're already sort of undertaken in terms of identifying where growth might happen. What we're saying is not just identify the site, but actually work out in advance what's the height of the building you want there that you think is acceptable, what's its form, mass, scale. That gives you your density, what land use is. You think about that in advance and give basically more guidance to the developer if they want to purchase the land, and certainly as part of the local plan process you'd have had discussion with your local residents about what scale of development is acceptable on all your different site allocations. So it's upfront work rather than waiting until the planning application stage.
So do you envisage that there would be, the boroughs would have sort of their own density matrix within their own local plans based on that assessment? Or is it something that's
it's more likely that what we'd expect is to say that a site, you can have a 4 or 10 story building here, we expect it to be these different land uses. This is the capacity of this site. If you build, this is what we're expecting to happen on this site. Thus, what likely housing you're going to have, what your population is going to be, your infrastructure needs, and it links into the borough's infrastructure, delivery plans. So you can plan it all in advance. Now, yes, it is a lot of work that needs to be done up front.
It does happen. I mean, if you look at Haringey and Hounslow's site allocations plans, which are published online, these are probably two really good examples of type of proactive planning, site-specific, makes very clear what type of land uses, height and density is appropriate for all their main sites. And so basically we don't expect boroughs to repeat ad infinitum the policies we've got. We want them to do planning like that, which is more site-specific, design-led potentially. It gives far greater certainty.
Planning rather than reactive.
Yeah, because we've already got 500 pages of affordable housing policies or overarching density policies. They don't need repetition.
Okay. Chair. Wait a minute, just Finn wanted to come in quickly on this. And then Tony, and then Navin. But I mean, this is Tom's set of questions.
From experience of being an officer for 5 years, interpreting the previous density matrix in negotiations with developers, the matrix was a starting point and was often seen as a minimum. The upper threshold was taken as a minimum by developers, and your conversations went from there, often on a site-by-site basis, without the context of a wider urban approach to how you shape a place. Certainly in what we're doing with public practice, which is bringing design expertise into the public sector, it's been very interesting seeing what kind of roles local authorities are asking for, particularly as the expressions of interest process happened after the publication of the draft London Plan. And we've had everyone from Bexley, Brent, Havering, Hounslow, Lewisham, Newham, Sutton, Tower Hamlets, Waltham Forest all come in with roles specifically to do this kind of work. So looking at how they can take a design-led, trying to understand what a design-led approach to densification would look like in their areas.
Will they be doing these? Sorry to
exactly. So these people will be individuals.
They'll be doing these these frameworks for each part of the borough.
Yes, yeah, and admittedly that's not all the London boroughs. It's only one person in each of those places. It's the first cohort of public practice. It's a relatively untested model, but they're outstanding people. There's a healthy supply of them who want to do this work in local authorities. The issue for when you're in that position is the tendency to get dragged downstream. There is some funding available for local authorities now, probably more than there has been over the last 10 years, because you've got a 20% uplift in fees that's coming in very shortly, if not already. Vacancies in planning departments that they haven't been able to fill, which actually are quite significant, because we've been told 100% of local authorities in London have problems recruiting the right people, which is almost a bigger issue than the funding actually at the minute for them.
That's what worries us.
You've got DCLG planning delivery funding, MHCLG planning delivery funding now available specifically for design skills, and you've got planning performance agreements, which are tools that are able to use. So the funding is there. I think this plan could be even stronger in arguing for moving that resource upstream.
I think that's the key phrase. Moving the democracy and the planning and the focus of people's time upstream, call it plan-led if you like, but making and getting the clarity, so we make the approach in London less weird in the way that it is in historic and comparative terms. I think that's absolutely crucial.
And ultimately doing that kind of planning is what will attract talented people into the public sector. Those are the kind of jobs that actually people become planners to do. So as someone who's done that kind of work, I really welcome that emphasis, but we need to do everything we can to give that more power rather than simply default to prescriptions that are ignored in any case.
I'd quite like to put a different point of view, which is that all London boroughs are different and they do things differently. What's being asked for here is extraordinarily resource intensive. If you're dealing with an application in Westminster, you're dealing with 13,500 planning applications. When I was there, I did an analysis, 80% of them involved some kind of design component. You might say it was small scale, it was a shop front, it was a sign, it was a residential extension, it was a development, it was a major site in Victoria. So you're actually and the statutory work, 40% reduction in staffing, small bits, the 20%, let's be careful because it's not ring fenced, it can actually go elsewhere.
Well, it's supposed to be.
It's not though, because there are ways of doing things. So the difficulty is that you're dealing with 8 and 13 week cases. which are the things that you're required to make responses on. And the rest of it can be done in a more, in a sense, generic way. So if you have a large number of conservation areas, and most, Lambert's got the most, then you will have generic policies within there which will actually talk about things like the expectation of extensions, or if they're Edwardian, Victorian buildings, it might be done in this way. You might even have roof policies, although I have to say they would not comply with the expectations of X stories on top of not just mansards that's contained within here. So, but that is a different way of doing things than actually walking down every single street, because we're not just talking about the major sites in Hounslow, we're actually talking about one unit here. We're actually talking about design codes, we're talking about LDOs, we're talking about a range of things which have been around as a vocabulary for some time. And the reason that they haven't been developed is because there simply isn't the staff time. And it's not to do with the fact that the staff couldn't expertly do it. The place is stuffed full of urban designers, conservation officers, architects working in different authorities. But they're actually, in that sense, at the coalface, dealing with the applications with guidelines which probably are a depressed vehicle at the moment in terms of delivering the uplift that we all know we've got to try and work towards.
If I just follow that up, because I agree with a lot of that around proportionality, and I think it could be clearer here where officers will spend far more hours per unit on householder extensions and small scale schemes than on the really large ones. And I think anything we can do to support local authorities to shift their attention and their existing expertise, which is considerable, to the schemes that are going to make the biggest difference, be more proportional about the way they assess schemes, would be very useful. I think the other aspect is the timing of it. So the Draft London Plan puts a lot of emphasis on design review, which is it can be a very powerful tool, but only in addition to existing in-house resource, and that's recognised. But the reality is that, a lot of the major decisions are taken far before the design review even comes in.
I think design review is a dangerous path to go down. Yeah. It happens late, it can happen. I'm sure there's great examples, but I've certainly seen examples where the people coming in don't really know the scheme, don't really know this bit of the borough. So I'm not to attack people doing it, but I think it's not the right way to...
I mean, it should be an additional, something that's additional. The other aspect is what...
Because what do you think is not the right way?
Design review. I don't think we should rely on design review.
Oh, it's a very heavy thing in this plan.
Yeah. But it's something that can supplement in-house resource, but it's not a substitute for it. A lot of the work has to be done earlier on when the developer's coming with a blank sheet of paper.
So
and
who's
the scheme is
going to
most
do it?
valuable.
Well, I think ideally you... Sorry, I think we're agreeing with you. I mean, talking about house extensions, and you're quite right, ridiculous amount of time gets taken into that. And push the detail, and this is below the London Plan, but the London Plan can set the framework. Push the detail to be as close to regulatory as you can. So what is acceptable in this part of London as an extension is just black and white. There will always be some rough justice around that, so you need to have a pressure cooker, of course, so that officers are not getting their time taken into deciding whether this, that, and the other. Just make it absolutely robust.
Yeah.
Jules, you have to go in a moment, don't you? How long have you got?
Yes, I'm meant to be with the mayor.
I don't want you to go.
I should meant to be with the mayor.
Bar the doors. He's desperate to come in.
No, I want to know how long have we got you?
I'm meant to be in the mayor's office physically in 11 minutes.
He doesn't need you, we do. It's okay.
Right. It's a pity he's more important than us. But anyway, but Jules, because I would like you to comment back on, but we've got Michael Bach and Elspeth to come in.
I'll be very brief. I'm going to offer a compromise.
Tony.
What I'm hearing is the system's under-resourced, and despite the 20%, it's not really going to make a scrap of difference. That this is an untested model. So why not leave the matrix in as a benchmark? You can still have your design-led approach, but to actually use it as a guideline.
Well, as I said before, the upper limits are still in there, but they're indicative of something else rather than...
But you probably want the lower ones as well to stop people building at too low a density. Haven't spotted that one.
Well, no, as I said earlier, there are 15% each year that do come in lower.
Yes. But
I think we're agreeing that this is a huge step change from what we do now to what we're trying to do. Have you done some study with the boroughs to show they have huge capacity issues Because Westminster may be able to do this, to fly my own flag, I'm not quite sure some of the other boroughs will be able to pick this up.
Elspeth, come in.
Can I come also in on this? You mentioned Haringey, you mentioned site allocations. We in our Amenity Society have been very closely involved in the site allocations. We suggested 5. Well, we suggested something like 30 initially, but they were narrowed down to 5. What we have is a strange situation, which is that we're not anti-development, we've identified these sites, but the response we're getting back from Haringey is to cram as much as you can on them. And the point that somebody made, which is that density figures are actually more of a minimum than a maximum, that they're constantly exceeded, does seem to be very much the case, and certainly our experience. We've had one particular site allocation case that did go to planning, and it had your design criteria 4 or 5 stories. It went in at 7 stories. We're in a conservation area. We're right next to a very important local space, and this was granted on the basis of viability. And the council's attitude, and the developer managed to convince them, is they wouldn't get any affordable housing unless they developed to this density. And it's quite considerably over density, and it's driven a coach and horses through all those guidelines. And it does worry me. I mean, we mentioned local context here. I mean, site allocations don't seem to take local context into consideration as much as they should do. And I believe that this needs looking at quite seriously. I don't believe that this top-down approach is going to work. And can I also say these sites are also duplicated in our neighbourhood plan, which has just been adopted. And again, we have this slight tension between what the community wants and what we thought we were getting and what we put forward in good faith to the borough, Haringey, and what we've got back instead.
Sunand, and then perhaps Jules should respond.
I mean, you've got to go. I think that there's an opportunity here to really get a better grip on density, and I think it's an opportunity that's being missed. There is a lot to be said against PTAL and a lot in favour of it. It was a fantastic idea to relate density with accessibility and so on. It was path-breaking and brilliant. Just we need to refine it and make it better. We need, for example, PTAL ignores context really. It also ignores other ways of travel. ATOS is another system that is used for for active travel. It's a disappointment that is not seized hold of in this plan. I think the whole density issue is complex and difficult, but I think intellectually it would have been possible to seize hold of it better. And I just would love to see in any revisions that we actually make a better fist of doing that.
And I fear that comes back to the point I made right at the start, where I don't disagree with anything in the good growth chapter, but because the case is intellectually summarised for high density, and there is a case, but the case isn't intellectually summarised for lower density, and there's a case for that as well. I think it's the combination of that will, I think, just put perhaps inappropriately upward pressure. And I think if you were able, actually I'm not so sure on the matrix, but I think certainly if you were able to start systematising or expecting boroughs to systematise some of the other ratios of how a city works, some of the ratios I was talking about earlier in terms of street to width, block length. This is really, really important because, as I think probably as all of us know, it isn't actually density per se that people have a problem with. It is actually how it looks and how it performs and how it fits in. And you can get, and we've done this, you can get off the scale support for community-led schemes which are higher density than the developer one when it fits in with the web and weave and other things are right. So I think if you're able to get into that a bit more, I think that would be helpful to your others.
So one more small thing, which is that I think there must be an underlying suspicion that if we stuck to the old density matrix, we wouldn't achieve the numbers. And I think a lot of it is driven by, not a sufficient grip on the total numbers needed. Because if, for example, you cap densities at 350 we found, which is in the top range but not the highest range, you would reduce London's pipeline of development by at least 35,000 homes. Where is that calculation in all of this? And I think we should get hold of it in a bigger way.
Later, Nicky.
Well, I've asked you now.
That's not one of my questions, Nicky.
Okay.
But if someone that's question 8.
Well, okay.
I've got a couple on community involvement. If we can.
We'll get on to that too.
Yeah.
Jules.
Yeah, well, I agree with
Well, I just want to say, we've got so many questions around this that you're not going to hear.
I think perhaps we need to have a series of meetings. I mean, I agree with a number of things that were said, particularly by Nicholas and Elspeth, but I think some of those arguments can equally be made for not sticking to what others perceive as a top-down approach with Matrix. The intention is to be bottom-up, to actually have localities deciding the density that can be achieved, the capacity of small local areas. And I totally take the point about capacity within boroughs, but I think that pertains regardless of the process and the regime that one adopts, that we need to strengthen it.
Yeah.
Do you get the impression that we feel you're jumping into the deep end and you can't swim?
I do get that's what you're saying, yes.
I'll just add one point. If you look at the research by LSE, they point out when they're looking at what are the outcomes of the discussions with developers about density, and is it the matrix that's being followed, or is it a more complicated process? And they argue that it's a more complicated process of local decision making about the right form, the right height of buildings. There's multiple different components of this whole process, and so it isn't just that the density matrix is being implemented and if you get rid of it it's suddenly a whole new process. It's already a very complicated process at the moment that isn't actually following the density matrix, and so we're trying to sort of strip out and make it sort of simpler and explain, okay, you need to do these processes in this order to come up with a successful sustainable development. That's what we're hoping to achieve.
One other point on density and affordable housing that's perhaps just worth very quickly mentioning, which is, although clearly mathematically in the first few years, higher density allows you to get more value out of a scheme and to pay for more affordable housing. Certainly, the longitudinal information and data is that big buildings cost a lot more to run. I mean, exponentially, not just more per unit, more because of more units, but more per unit, and that. Based on historical data, you obviously can't completely predict the future. That becomes more the case as they get older because standards change, you can't retrofit them, and what is a simple bit of DIY in a 2-up, 2-down house is a massive engineering job in a huge, great building. And so I think there's a legitimate question which is because I do believe, despite your good intention, there will be upward pressure on density in consequence of this, and I think to some degree it's your intent. But will that lead to developments that, however they look on paper as deals are being struck, actually become very bad ways for affordable housing into the medium to long term? Because I have to say, based on the past, that would be my concern. I can't prove that because we're talking about cash flows into the future. But I think it's a legitimate thing to keep in mind.
That is, there's a much tighter approach to affordability of things like service charges in the plan through the focus on management plans in a way that's not covered in the current plan. So we've sort of responded to the evidence that various density reports have shedded on that issue, and Good Growth by Design process did mention that as well.
And I totally recognise the pressure from some quarters to build up, but that we are not accepting, we're not equating higher density with taller buildings. There are, as I tried to outline earlier, there's any number of ways where we're thinking that densifying London is. There are all sorts of different typologies that we can look at, whether it's densifying industrial land to free up space, whether it's and as been pointed out earlier, space standards, internal space standards are absolutely being observed.
And I think some of the statements you make about just talking about where it is, about setting out design principles for various developments and getting that right in the months to come will, I think, in that context, be utterly crucial. And part of the plan will hinge on that.
I wanted to try and get through a couple of these other ones before Jules goes. I mean, I've got questions on community involvement and how the community gets a say on the key assessments of development capacity and design approaches for the future of their areas.
Well, probably Elliot can answer that on APFs and the like.
So the the processes we set out in policy D2, which are really key to implementing the density policy, is that you, through the plan making process or area strategies and our APFs and master plans, you have that discussion, a public discussion and consultation about what is the appropriate form of development, what the appropriate density is. So they'd be involved in at that stage. For design codes, maybe for small sites.
Can I just ask, because I said at the beginning, if it's not in the policy, it doesn't count. And if the SPG can have all sorts of things in it, but if it's not in the policy, it doesn't count. And is this in the policy, this consultation?
Well, it's required. This is a part of plan-making process. Now, plan-making has a statutory process that requires consultation. So it's implied that you have to do public consultation to do this process, because you have to as part of your plan-making process. As a
is this for this, the density range in an area?
This is
Do you have to consult on that?
Yes. So the idea that
we know for planning application you have to consult, but what about these master plans, these area design codes?
Chair, I'd like to talk about more than consultation, real engagement, because wherever you go, particularly out in other areas where there is distinctly a lot of pressure, a lot of growth, given that scenario and what we've been talking about, if you're serious about localities deciding, as Jules said, with this approach of sort of local development, we talked about all this time local authorities, planning authorities. We talked about our developers. Where does the community come in? Because they do not like. High densities are not generally an acceptable term when you look at local communities. They don't understand. They don't understand the implications. Tall buildings, we'll leave it for later on. But like Jules, you said, okay, fine. Planning approach is that high densities not automatically mean high-rise buildings, but that is what pretty much invariably happens. And that's where there's very, very strong opposition to what's going on and what will be happening. So that's where, unless we have serious engagement through policies, a policy requirement, it's not going to work. Because as it is, you get conflicts between local plans, local area action plans, and whether it's national policy framework or London plan, you get those contradictions, those clashes, and we haven't got any measures to deal with that. So that is something which London plan needs to very clearly address. I think there's a big gap at the moment. There's always been, but this will be even wider gap. If you're saying we're going to a bottom-up approach, great. But then if you're not going to actually engage where necessary, make them aware or educate local communities, you're not going to achieve both the objective of meeting the sort of growth challenge as well as developing the right character, right form of development in inner and outer areas.
I mean, these proposals will require boroughs to engage more on their local plans with local people.
Capacity building is a major problem there as well. Capacity building, how will that happen?
I'm not a planner. I'm going to turn to the planners to go into the ins and outs of how planning authorities conduct their business with their local residents.
They don't do it well, put it that way. Statutory consultation is not good enough for the stat change that we are talking about.
I would absolutely advocate going further. I mean, other than simply publishing it and asking for responses. I mean, certainly, I know for the OAPFs, and that is something that City Hall is involved in, and it's not just the boroughs. They're actually shared. The process is shared between City Hall and the borough, and I know that certainly on the latest one, that will soon be published, the Isle of Dogs and South Poplar OAPF. That there was extensive public engagement, public meetings. The mayor of Tower Hamlets attended several. There were numerous ones that took place, all facilitated by City Hall and the borough of Tower Hamlets. and that was sort of discussing these very issues, that how they apply to how they should apply to that locality.
I think we agree with that, and in fact we like the fact the Mayor's going to resource that the way community engagement can really take place. But it isn't. It's another point, but it's not there in your strategic areas of regeneration. But I think, and that's something we can talk about, but I do think there's an issue about at what stage the community get engaged in all these pre-site, pre-development application processes. Because if there's going to be a lot of change, and this is about behaviour change and change in accepting growth, then and higher densities, which can, if well designed, really work. And so, but we do need communities to be taken along, and it's not there in the policy boxes. You've got to require the boroughs to do it. It's got, if you're handing it over to the boroughs, then it's got to be required. And in some areas, like your strategic areas of regeneration, there's no way you should be handing that over to boroughs and other stakeholders. You should be in there resourcing it. But anyway, I wanted to ask Tom to put another question before you go, Jules, which is something that concerns us a lot, which is about the mix. You can say it, Tom. You've got the question there.
I think the size mix is Tony's question. I think.
Oh, I see. Well, okay.
Yeah, sorry, but I'm happy to put it. But I wouldn't want to tread on. I wouldn't want to tread on Tony's toes.
Well, okay, but anyway.
That's all about the appropriate size mix for housing.
Yeah, we're very worried about this.
So apologies to you, Tony. Yes, no, it's something we are very worried about. Yeah, so should boroughs be able to set the appropriate size mix for housing, or should it be left entirely to the market?
Well, we've been clear that they should set size mixes for affordable, for low rent affordable housing, but not size mixes for market housing. And the previous plans didn't set any size mixes for anything. So we think actually this is a tightening up by requiring size mixes for low rent affordable housing.
Yes.
I must say, the problem with size mixes, and particularly where schmars get manipulated, that they can actually require too much or too little. But left to the market will do, let's say, certainly in inner central London, will go for the large units for overseas investment rather than meeting the needs of the people who want to live in London. And there are areas, there's the opposite end of the spectrum, where developers are producing lots and lots of small units. And to steer them into something that's closer to what is their own or the GLA schmar mix would at least get it into the right ballpark. So the market will produce whatever it suits them and not necessarily what is needed. Does that make sense? In other words, it will produce whatever suits them to produce, but not necessarily what the schmars show as needed.
But what outcome are you trying to achieve?
To temper whether it's too many small or too many large ones, to get it closer to the sort of mix that's needed.
But the thing is that dictating someone builds 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom family-sized units in the market, many of them don't end up, the majority of them don't end up being occupied by families. They end up being shared by professionals. There's something like only a third of family homes in London are occupied by families.
Yes.
The other 2/3 aren't.
Yes.
And we can't dictate who ends up in those units.
It's not what's there, it is in what way you're topping up what's there to better...
But they won't be affordable. I think it's more important to concentrate on the affordable units and require...
No, I agree with that. Yeah. There's no shortage of large units except the wrong people in the market.
I'd have to think, I'd have to turn to those who are more...
Well, you've been very adamant in here that they definitely should not do it.
Yeah.
Not even leave them with the option to do it.
Yeah. There's more than that. There's a criteria in policy H12 by which we expect boroughs to have an influence in the mix. And in that it says there's also a general presumption against the provision of vote, like a scheme that in vast majority includes one bed. So a mix is implicit in our policies. What we've tried to do is give a much more nuanced policy framework that takes account things like the land use mix or the location, and the role of small units in meeting the need we've got, but also encouraging things like downsizing. So that's in contrast with the current status quo, where policies that really don't get followed, a bit like the conversations we're having about the density matrix, which would prescribe a table of the identified housing need and basically apply that rigidly to every single scheme that comes forward, irrespective of its design, location and land use. And so what we're trying to do is move away from that to a more nuanced approach where as Jules said, in line with their statutory duties, boroughs should prescribe a mix and set clear guidance about what they need to meet their statutory duties, and that relates to their housing list and the people who have need for low-cost rent. But on intermediate and market housing, a more nuanced, locationally specific approach.
Two follow-ups to that. Firstly, completely take your point, Jules, about who ends up occupying market sale housing. Doesn't mean that in the future that a family will not end up occupying the property at some point. We're losing, as we've already talked about earlier, larger homes being chopped up into smaller units as well. So I mean, I don't really know. I'm just wondering if over the longer term there is a danger that we're going to end up with lots and lots of small units and not enough larger units even on the market side.
Well, certainly in the medium term, it is smaller units that the market actually requires, isn't that right, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean the SHMA does show an overwhelming need for 1 and 2 bed units, but also a substantial need for family homes as well. But the important point as well is to recognise that the need for those family homes can be met by the whole stock. It's not just about a particular scheme that's come forward in an area that happens, you can free up existing homes and relieve pressure on them to be converted by providing the right type of units that meet the particular needs in that area. And that's what we're trying to give boroughs the sort of tool to do, and ensure that they're not applying a rigid requirement on every scheme that simply doesn't, that policy objective doesn't get implemented. So
you're doing what the government does, a one size fits all. In some areas, the market needs some adjustment, whether it's not too many of small or not too many of large. But if you leave it entirely to the market, I mean, okay, you've already said you don't want them to be dominated by 1 bedroom units, but that's the only guidance that you've given them. I think for each area it has a different market, and it should be tempered by what is appropriate locally.
There is something on market housing, though, isn't there, in 342, where you actually do say that you would encourage the local authorities to go for efficient use of land, i.e. tighter planning for market housing. So, I mean, doesn't that relate to the question that you were asking, which is that it's not...
Which one? Sorry, could you say again which paragraph?
Page 112. Paragraph 342
about housing standard
is the one about market housing, where local authorities are encouraged to get efficient use of land, i.e. to make them small and efficient rather than large.
But is this in relation to space standards rather than number of bedrooms? Yes.
Yes.
But the initial question was about these large sprawling.
But can I ask, you're trying to optimise some of these ones where the market produces lots of large units, you don't get enough units from the same bulk. And so, to quote James Murray, the site is wasted. The site is wasted because you should have got a different mix and more housing out of it.
So that's why intermediate housing, you're not, there's not going to be a specified size mix. And does intermediate include London Living Rent as well as shared ownership?
Intermediate does, yeah, and the reasons for the
because you might end up. You probably. I mean, I don't know what the figures are, but I would doubt. I mean, you are getting families obviously living in shared ownership. So why would you specify some sort of?
Well, one thing we do in the plan is acknowledge that families can live in 2-bed homes, and they do,
which I think,
and that can meet a need. And the main reason to that, it has to do with affordability. So it's all very well to require a 3-bed intermediate unit somewhere like Westminster, but if the only people who are going to be able to afford to live in it, or it won't be provided because it's not financially viable, and then it's not going to meet a family's needs. What actually might be more appropriate is a 2-bed unit that can encourage them to sort of staircase on as a family grows. I think we're concerned
actually about the idea, the language which suggests that 2-bed properties or could be regarded as family-sized housing. The fact
that's
that
something we could, look at.
Yeah, I think that the language needs. We were slightly worried about. I sort of understand where you're coming from, but it almost seems to justify overcrowding, which we wouldn't want to, which I'm sure isn't. Yeah, but of course, the 3-bed shared ownership might be appropriate. It might be affordable in Bromley, for example.
And we'd encourage that. So where it's viable, this policy seeks to encourage that the provision of family housing. It's not saying don't do something. It's just saying. To have a more nuanced approach, we're advising not prescribing the exact mix on every scheme. That's all this policy is doing, and then setting out a criteria which boroughs can use to achieve that.
Sure, but I just thought it was interesting that yes, low cost rent. You say yes, prescribe some size mix criteria, but not intermediate forms of housing.
Thanks, Ed. And the main answer to that question, which is going to come on to, is because you have a statutory function, you get nominations, you can insure and allocate a family to those homes. You can't do that for market housing. And London Living Rent obviously is a product that's geared towards. Sort of not families in all occasions, but where it's appropriate and financially viable, we'd see family-size London Living Rent units. But on the whole, it's geared at a particular kind of cohort and not necessarily meeting the same needs. But you also don't have nominations on intermediate housing, so you can't. There's the income thresholds and the London Living Rent rents. But, I mean, you would expect a lot of the 3-bed London Living Rent units to possibly be sharers, because subject to the income. But it's not mandated, we're just allowing that flexibility. But that's the main reason, it's because of nominations and the statutory duties that are very different on low-cost rent. And it is really worth reiterating, at current, the London plan only says that the mayor would encourage the provision of affordable family housing, that's it. Whereas this actually says to boroughs, specify in planning what kind of mix you need for that type to make sure that you actually meet that and reduce overcrowding. So it actually goes a lot further when it comes to housing mix, size mix on that tenure.
Can I just ask how you square that, you see, what you're saying? I find it all very reasonable what you're saying. But how do you square that with the fact that boroughs have got to do their own, I have to keep going back to this, because they've got to do their own sort of density range for an area of the borough, and that's only the number of units. And units, if you do units, then it doesn't really, and we've heard from Nicholas that people will be, landowners, land buyers will be speculating on the basis of the number of units they can get on. So they're much more likely to work out in advance, we want absolutely loads and loads of 1-bed, because 1-bed are much cheaper to build. And I don't understand how, because they'll already have done all that in advance. So they'll come along with their market, mainly in most areas of London, they'll come along with a market mix, which won't be much of a mix, it'll be mainly 1-bed.
Well, the policy suggests as a general presumption against mainly 1-bed proposals, so that we'd hope to filter into planning decisions.
Where does it say that?
Policy B, so it's H12B. It says generally schemes consisting mainly of one person units and or 1-bedroom units should be resisted, and then there's further guidance on this in paragraph 4.12.5.
Should be resisted in what? In what quantities?
Well, it has to do with the aspiration for mixed and balanced communities, mixed and inclusive communities.
But the SHMAR actually has 55%.
Yeah, I mean, but that goes to the heart of what we're saying. We're trying to give more nuance rather than prescribe in detail the exact mix for schemes. So the London plans never had a housing mix requirement. Local plans have, but the London plans never had that.
Okay, well, we'll have to come back to that.
Nicky, could Andrew clarify? He said that the not having a mix specified was advisory. But it doesn't look very advisory when it's written in the policy and it says they should not. Can you clarify, is it advisory or is it policy?
It's policy, yeah. It's as worded in policy H12C.
So you're saying they essentially they must not do it?
No, you're misreading it. Sorry, it says boroughs should not set a prescriptive dwelling size mix, and then it says in brackets in terms of the number of bedrooms for market intermediate. So it doesn't say don't require a mix. It says don't prescribe it in the number of units. So that's what I was talking about in terms of just saying.
So if they said 50% this and 50% that, that's prescriptive, is it?
If it was applied on every single scheme, it would be prescriptive.
But why do you think it's applied rigidly on every single scheme? It's meant to get people into the right ballpark.
There are boroughs
that forbidding them to do it.
There are boroughs that have more nuanced takes on this. So, for example, Brent have a policy, I think it's Brent, don't quote me on this, that has a strategic target for 25% or whatever percent it is to be family homes across the whole borough. So that implicitly takes account of the different types of sites play different roles in the housing mix that's needed.
So if they said 50-50, they would just be conforming generally with this policy, or would they be not conforming with the policy?
I missed the first bit, sorry.
So you can write local policies and you have to justify them. And that is about conforming generally. You try and do it, but it doesn't work for you. This doesn't seem to be, this is unequivocal. Sorry, I haven't got it right. Unequivocal. It says no.
Mm-hmm.
Computer says no. Is that what's intended?
It's about the level of prescription, not requiring a mix. That's what the policy sort of is very clear about. It's not to be prescriptive about the mix.
That is not how anybody reasonable would interpret that. That looks like no.
No to prescriptive dwelling size mixes. That's what it says. Yeah.
Well, I think we unless anyone else wants to come in on this, we should.
Sorry, Chair, I've had phone calls. I've had someone coming through the door waving a file at
Can I just ask?
You've been magnificent,
Can I just ask if you mentioned about having another meeting, Jules? Could you talk to officers in our team about that? Because I think it would be a good sometime during the process that it doesn't just go through the whole process without us having another discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, we will. That's good because there's some things we really need to thrash out. Thanks very much. And your team's still here to be your eyes and ears. Right, I would like us to go back now, if that's all right, to the density. I think we haven't dealt with question 6.
Yeah, a couple more. So, this is an important
density
one
and design.
On how the design scrutiny will take place. In particular, if there are enough people with the design and negotiation skills in boroughs or available to boroughs, and who pays. Sorry, I'll repeat that. So the question is about how the design scrutiny will take place. Are there enough people with the design and negotiation skills in boroughs or available to boroughs, and who pays?
So we're saying in the policy that design scrutiny is the job of the borough initially. So that's the design officers, the case officers would be doing the scrutiny, but we're also encouraging and requiring certain circumstances that there's a design review process that happens at the pre-application stage, so early enough when it actually can have a useful input. And then as part of the Good Growth by Design programme, the mayor's providing guidance.
So design review, that's a pre-application stage?
Yes. So that's the stage when it's most useful.
Yeah.
That's fine. And but in terms of what the design review should do in the process is the mayor's providing guidance for how that should be done across London. And so that there's a high quality and an equal standard across London. So I think maybe historically it's been sort of varied the quality of design review. But we're not saying that design review is the only thing that you'll be doing. We're just saying another thing that we think is very important in terms of getting the right design. So will
these be independent? These are independent people. This is like a design review panel that the borough will call on, or are these officers within boroughs that are doing
so the sort of guidance and the charter the mayor's sort of drafted at the moment is that they're independent. It sets out how they should be, the different various skills they should have and how the process should work. So it's meant to be independent, and then but the borough also does its own. It already does that already. So it's part of this normal process. So it's raising the profile of doing design assessments in the planning applications process. I think that's really encouraging. We think that's really important.
I mean, we do recognise the challenge of the resources. I mean, it's not like we don't, but I think we're trying to put the emphasis in terms of where the resources go in terms of different skill sets, and putting it up the gender will help engender more emphasis of this.
I mean, ultimately, it should be less work, but that won't be true in the transition. I can imagine it'd be a nasty
But I think we
approach
want to go through this transition.
We were doing some research at the end of last year, which actually sheds an interesting light on this. It's not very London relevant, but I think it may be helpful. We were doing some research, which we'll be publishing soon, on why people are NIMBYs, why do people oppose new housing, and we were doing a literature review, mainly in English, I regret to say, and we obviously a lot of evidence is American, and it took us a while to work out what was different, and of course it was blindingly obvious, which was all the debates, or many of the debates in America, happen at the plan-making process when you're doing the zoning or the coding, or whatever it is, and codes are increasingly used in the US. So the nature of the literature was very, very dramatically different to the literature we're reading in England. And I think we do need to go down that way. But it will be, I think, it'll be a tough
So
transition.
whereas here it happens at the point of the application.
Yes, because here we have a development-led control process where officials, and Finn will talk about this far more eloquently than I can, are massively overworked. And it comes back to, the other thing that came out of this, we were looking at what's the primary sign-off you need across European countries. The primary sign-off you need in most of Europe in various different languages is essentially a building sign-off that you are compliant. Because essentially what you're allowed to build has been previously set. And this is, this is true of Gaullist France as it is of quite a few, they're not all bits of America. But so the concept of planning permission, the way that we understand it, it's not an attack on planning, really, it's just a subtlety. As it's used in England and in Ireland, is just not known in most of Europe. Because is this in compliance with plan? Yes, off you go. No, it's a more regulatory process. Now you can't go the whole way there, but I think if we could move it some of the way there, and I think London is the sort of place where you can more easily do that than some others. I think that would be a massively important step forward.
So to be clear,
Elspeth wants to come in first.
And just 2 or 3 points on design review panels. First of all, they're very, in my experience, both as a person who's been vetted by them and also has tried to use them, is they're incredibly variable. There seems to be no consistency. Finn and I sat on an RIBA panel planning committee where we looked at how to get them more skilled. I think we hit the buffers on that, didn't we?
The progress is being made now.
Yes. So they are variable, but my main point is they come in too late, and they come in as critics rather than creators. By the time we see, this is my other hat on, by the time we see a scheme, it is virtually set in stone. The mass, the scale, the height is established even at pre-application stage, because it's been driven by what the site capacity wants, what the developer wants, what other factors. And I've seen very good design review panels twiddle with the elevations and throw a scheme out because they didn't like it, and they come back and they use some more twiddly bits on the elevations, and it gets approved. Whereas actually what was fundamentally wrong with it was the principle. And I've spoken in this particular case to the chief of planner, who said, the head of planning, the head of development control, who said, can't do anything about it. We'll be taken to the cleaners, we'll be taken to appeal.
But Elspeth, in this actually says design scrutiny should be delivered, the policy suggests that it should be delivered at an early stage.
Yes, I'm saying, but how?
That is exactly what the plan
that's
is
exactly,
saying.
that is absolutely...
And what I would say to that is
that
that we have not yet assembled skilled... Generally, design review has been on a scheme, case by case. So our track record so far isn't very deep in delivery.
It's critique rather than creation. What we need is at an earlier stage, we need more input into the design process. And the whole thing about a design review panel is it's reviewing what's already there, and it's very often too late.
Can I come in on that? Because the research that is informed the London Quality Review Charter, which is referenced here as part of the Good Growth by Design agenda, which is trying to establish better quality for design review across London. Also identifies one of the major issues with design review is coverage. So timing, yes, but also coverage. Currently, only 28% of my major applications covered by design review at best. And that's actually 1.5% of all planning applications. So even if you've got fantastic design review process of consistent quality across London coming in at an earlier stage, there's still going to be a huge volume of development that never even goes in front of those panels. And I think that's where the in-house capacity and the emphasis on in-house capacity at the earliest stages come in. And the best authorities are doing that already. They're insisting that developers come to them not with a pre-formed scheme, but with a red line and a blank sheet of paper, and have those discussions from the beginning. And with the right expertise in-house, you can have a constructive discussion where it isn't attritional and trying or tweaking elevations as opposed to really dealing with the fundamentals of the scheme. But I think extra emphasis on local authorities establishing those kind of systems. It's kind of anywhere Mike Kiley's been has that system, Tower Hamlets, Croydon, Bexley, Brent, would really help. Also then make the case for getting better off, the right kind of skills invested at that stage. And there's certainly, the skills are out there in the private sector. They're willing to work for the public sector. And that's what we've learned from our the first call for our first cohort of public practice. We had 212 applications for just 16 spots, and the quality is outstanding. But we do need local authorities to be encouraged to offer those roles. More local authorities to offer more of those kind of roles and create those job descriptions as well.
Well, therein lies the rub, because there are 32 plus 1 London boroughs, and they all have different ways of working. There are certainly some areas who have less proposals, and therefore they have less staffing in those areas, and they have people that have shared roles. It's not just design, it's also people who are skilled in conservation, who will be dealing with tourism, and they absolutely know nothing about timber frame buildings. But the difficulty is the money. There are at least 2 London boroughs who will not want to adopt this proposal because they have extraordinarily well-staffed and competent urban design officers. So to say they're not having the scrutiny, I'm not quite sure that I understand that completely, because there are certainly certain boroughs who do complete design scrutiny on every single application, and there are obviously others that don't have that. But there are difficulties in terms of timing, because the proposals have got to be ratcheted through as fast as possible, and design panels simply can't meet every week. There's one design panel for one local authority that has 70 members. If you talk to the individual members, they say it's a nightmare because they can't build up any rapport with the people that they're dealing with. So every single time they have a design panel, it's like sort of starting from fresh, and they can't work through it. I know I haven't read the code of conduct yet, or the parameters, the charter for it. Although I have to say, when one of the meetings I went to, when they talked about the code of conduct, Lowland principles, I would say something like 95% of the people in the room had no idea what was being talked about. So who knows what there has been in the past about probity, and there were certainly some issues with CABE in relation to that. But the thing is about consistency. You've got to have that, and the relationship also with the politicians, because design panels don't really meet the politicians, and it's the politicians who are actually making the decisions to the most part. Despite delegated action, they are the people that are looking certainly at the key applications. So I'm very much for design skills being embedded in local authorities, but I don't know where the resources are going to come from those that don't already have it. And those design skills also need to be there, not just for dealing with the applications, but for doing the policy basis as well. Because quite often you'll find policy people writing it who actually have no design expertise whatsoever, and that's a further problem.
I think that it's the question isn't whether design review panels will solve the need that exists. That isn't, that it's obvious it won't. I think Finn's given the figures, and everybody who's been involved in it knows instinctively that it's actually impossible. The point is whether they have a role at all, how that role can be brought to the front end where it hasn't been sufficiently in the past, and does that need different kinds of skills? To recognise that actually when you engage a design review panel, you are getting advice at probably half cost as compared to buying it on the market.
An architect speaks.
this is the problem with architects, they charge themselves out at half cost. And indeed, landscape architects and all the other multidisciplinary teams that now populate design reviews, because it is actually an old process, and at its best, it's very good. So the question is really how to judiciously deploy them and not see it as an answer. So any policy that relies on design review panels actually providing scrutiny will not succeed. But a policy that totally ignores this kind of a resource in context of often sticking plasters are what's needed, I think it'll be foolish to ignore it as a resource. And it is spreading, people are getting more expert. I think there's a whole untapped resource. This is slightly off-piste, but I think in universities, colleges and higher education, there are people who I think could do really good design review who are not being recruited into this process.
Can I just say one very quick thing, just a bit provocatively, with an apology to the various architects on the table with me. There's a couple of schemes we've been involved with working with communities, which have in one way or another touched design review, and they did highlight one challenge, I think. We've consistently found, both in our research and in other academic research that we've read, what we call the design disconnect, which is that there are some measurable differences between what professional planners and designers like and what the rest of the public does. And that's not a criticism, it's a fact. If you're approaching it as an intellectual exercise because you spend your whole life doing it, to some degree you're going to get to a different point after so many years. And I'm saying one particular scheme where essentially something that I know is wildly popular locally was very, very roughly treated by the design review panel, despite the fact that in that bit of London it was very popular with local residents. It wasn't very innovative, it was quite small C conservative design. So I think you've just got to be careful that you don't get a process where the design review extends and enhances that design disconnect, which I think is a legitimate problem in worrying about support for new housing.
And where are conservation area committees, and where are amenity societies, civic societies, who often are populated by architects with particularly interesting views, who are mostly involved in doing the design review that we're talking about? So there are areas of London now, certainly some areas where there may be less architects, but they are very much, many of them are involved in looking at applications, and they don't seem to be spoken about anywhere. It's almost as if the service that they give and the continuity, the deep understanding that they have, because they either live or work in an area, because amenity societies aren't always stuffed full of residents, they can be people who run businesses in the area, but they're not in a sense referenced. It's as if the scrutiny that they've done has little value.
I think there is an issue about this whole design process completely bypassing the people who actually, and it says in the beginning of the plan, it's wonderful, it says we need to take advantage of the knowledge and experience of people within the planning process. But I think I would like to see that included in the design process, because people at all levels who live in a neighbourhood, I've got experience of this, really do add enormously to the way the whole, because design's holistic. It's not just about how the facade looks. It's about all sorts of issues. And I do think if we don't include communities in that, we're going to have problems. We've already seen what happens. Well, we're much more aware than we were, I think, a few years ago, in what happens if you actually don't involve communities in decisions which really affect their lives.
Can I just add to that point?
What?
Could I add to that point? I come from a civic society, amenity group background. What's happening here is just another bit of the front end of the process, which is a private deal where the community is not included. When we get to these golden uplands where the community has been involved in drawing up the kind of picture of the kind of area that they want, then you've got community input into it. But at this stage, all we've got is another group of people meeting in private. Very often their report doesn't actually get into the public domain, and they might be influential, they might not be, but the point is that there's a professional consensus between the officers, the architects and the developers, and now this panel, before the community ever get to hear or see anything. And then you're surprised. They don't like it. And it's an uphill battle. Very often we're not fighting the developers, we're fighting the council.
That's the point I was trying to make, that at what stage. It's got to be at a much earlier stage.
Yeah.
You want the local community engaged, not consulted, on what they see as a kind of fait accompli, having gone through the whole process, and then say, this is what you're going to get.
So you think people are pissed off at the moment? People are feeling that they're not engaged, but the process is working in a way that they don't get engaged or can't get engaged until it's all cut and dried.
And what? Julie, want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to completely agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why, in terms of D2, we're talking about...
Which policy?
D2. The first one. Oh, sorry,
102.
Which is why when we talk about boroughs taking an evaluation of understanding, all these issues in terms of their areas, they're doing that in preparing their development plans. Now, as part of that, they've got issues and options state, they've got other stages, and yes, the emphasis is on that, and the implicitness is about boroughs working with those communities to do that, but that's about bringing all of that discussion up front as far as possible. So I think we agree with that.
And that's why I'm portraying as the golden uplands when we get there. In the meantime, we're in a situation where the community is locked out. And when we go back to density, and that's being agreed, really high density is being agreed between the officers and a developer, we've got no say.
I'd say that the policy's trying to get away from that. It's saying you should plan.
Well, I don't see the words anything about community, public consultation, engagement.
So the development plan process has that set out in terms of that engagement and those stages.
No, but I think particularly in this policy.
Well, I mean, that's something we could probably have a
we
look at.
We can think about it.
Yeah, definitely strengthen if we need to, because we think it's implicit, but if it's not, then that's something we can look at.
And one practical thought, and slightly jumping ahead in the agenda just quickly, is in the section you've got further in section D on design codes and small sites, and I put a little thing, a note I sent around members, why not put into the policy at the London Plan level that you're expecting communities to get involved with that, and community co-design, and we're doing this with 2 neighbourhood fora right now. They love it. It's actually very doable. But build it in here. So there's good stuff here, I think, in Steve's, I can't remember what it is, the small sites one, but bring that in there would be our practical suggestion to achieve your
I think that's something we want.
But there's nothing on localism in this document that I could find, and nothing on neighbourhood forums, who are a statutory body and the bottom end of the planning process, and I'm very disappointed in that. I as someone who's worked very hard on the production of a plan, I feel...
I did a Control F on neighbourhood planning. It didn't come up with many. It did come up with a couple. But,
legally. And I feel, that is a big error within this document, that there is no mention of this.
Because there's so much passion that you can unleash with neighbourhood fora and civic societies for good development. And although I agree that a couple of ones you recognise that, it doesn't the sort of. And I'm sorry, I don't mean this personally, but the sense that you believe it, I'm not saying you don't, but the sense that you believe it doesn't sort of filter through the plan. Now, I apologise if that's unfair.
All very good points. So I definitely agree with what you're saying. I just think a more fundamental point to make at this point is about the role of the London Plan and how it's used, because well, it's more in terms of there's statutory legislation for consultation, whether it's on an application, what pre-app, that's set by government. The consultation that you have on any kind of plan, whether it's a design code, supplementary guidance, they're all set out in national legislation. So while we could have policies that ask for, thorough involved consultation with different groups in the plan, the weight of the plan is used to test applications, because it's part of the development plan, and the conformity in general of a local plan with this document. That's its main role. So it can't change legislation and process that boroughs have to do anyway for consulting their residents on applications or plans. I just thought it's worth making that clear, because we can't expect the plan to do things it doesn't have the legislative remit to do.
But Andrew, this plan, more than any other plan, the previous two, is giving a lot more responsibility to boroughs.
At local
And
level.
I certainly agree with that.
Can I provide a
And
clarification?
you agree with that. And in doing so, and it's also putting in a number of processes which boroughs haven't had to undertake before. And I think I can't see the contradiction there with legislation, because you're actually adding layers that boroughs have to do, and it would be right to engage communities.
I certainly agree with that. The only point I was making is if we set out clear guidelines to boroughs to follow in terms of their process, that doesn't have any legislative weight, whereas the processes that are set out to a borough...
Does if you put it in the box.
Can I just provide some clarification? So we have made a very deliberate attempt to say development plans to mean all sorts of plans, and we've set out in the introduction that clarification point 0.9 about the fact that the London Plan is part of the London Planning Authority's development plan. Actually, neighbourhood planning is set out at that level that development plans, it's right at the intro.
We've got it is mentioned.
Yeah, and that's at that stage, it's mentioned there to say, when we say development plans, we mean all of it. So we don't say, list them, all of them, all the way through the plan, everywhere. So that was a very deliberate attempt to say it applies to everything.
Yes. I just feel that somehow it could have
sometimes
been
it can be
somewhere.
yeah, I mean we take the point that somehow some places it needs to be brought out a bit stronger, and I think we're quite open to look at reflecting that, but I think it's just to provide the clarification that we made that attempt to try and shorten it where we can up front.
But it has been so instrumental within government policy in delivering housing, particularly increased housing. I think it's quite important in terms of the other discussions.
Yeah, and I think we recognise that, but we've
got to move on.
Tall building. I think we've got to wrap up this bit. I think co-creating, involving communities in the design process is new.
Yeah, I think we recognise
codes, I would suggest, as they're going to be quite important.
And also looking at those density ranges in different areas of the borough. Somebody, I hope we can get on to tall buildings.
Tall buildings.
Which is our final topic.
Tall buildings, D8.
Building tall buildings. Tall buildings? Tall buildings. Okay. Well, the committee has done over the years a lot of work on tall buildings. Soon there has been to a couple of those as well. The question is to everyone on the panel, what are your views on our committee work? Which I think that there were two areas which we very clearly flagged up as something you'd like to see happen. One was to consider other building configurations when you look at a particular site or a particular project, and also arising from Skyline campaign and various deliberations we had. Second thing we said should be considered was Skyline Commission set up to look at how to sort of get benefits from a well-designed, well-placed, clustered or not high-rise buildings. So, do we have views on getting to a stage where London Plan actually promotes or requires, rather than just promoting, different configurations before one sort of ends up with a particular form of development?
Yes, so there's two different policies tackle this issue. So policy D2, part B, what we've been talking about most of the meeting is about the borough's plan, figuring out the most appropriate form of development for different areas, different sites in a locality. So that will go through thinking about what's the most appropriate building form as one of those processes. And that will be the process you use to identify where, if anywhere in your borough, tall buildings are acceptable. But then you'll also be talking about different height buildings, different forms of buildings. Policy D4.C talks about the qualitative aspects of housing developments, and in the supporting text it says that alternative arrangements to accommodate the same number of units or bedrooms with different relationships to the surrounding context have been explored early in the design process. So we're advocating that exercise is done. So I think that's what we feel we are addressing that particular.
Can this be reflected clearly, almost as prior condition within the tall building policy section that we have? Because this is very vital. Because it's okay. I've heard Jules say this evening. I've heard when we are doing
say having discussions on older common MDC, where say yes, we do not mean high density automatically converted into tall buildings, fine, but to stop that happening on the ground, we need to have stronger, clearer policies, and that's where within tall building section, whether there can be specific.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely make that link. I think I just want to make the general point that the plan is read as a whole, so an application on tall buildings would definitely have to take account of the design policies as well, but we can make that link for us or consider it as part. Okay, so.
A number of questions on this. First of all, historically, the London Mayor actually has gone further than the boroughs in promoting tall buildings. So it's not that the boroughs are doing all these tall buildings and the Mayor is exercising some kind of restraint. It's the other way around.
Yes.
So now the suggestion is that which is in principle good if the following applies, that each local authority has a proper consultation with local people in all the ways that we've just talked about and produces a plan which determines and is agreed by everyone where tall buildings should be and so on. And everybody has discussed it. The only deficiency in that would be that actually tall buildings very often have impacts way beyond the borough, and we need to deal with that. However, in principle, that's okay, again, if the capacity is there to do it and so on and so forth. Would the Mayor then still say, no, this should be denser, call in a scheme and give permission to a tall building where it's in contravention to the local plan?
Well, I think if the borough has set those things out, and I think we recognise that they haven't done that necessarily in the past, and we're putting a lot of resources in our team in terms of looking at local plan conformity a lot more to make sure that those policies, but actually in terms of they don't necessarily, they obviously have to do the identification, but like we've said, we've tried to make this plan directive so these are they don't have to repeat our policies.
But you know, if the local authority, genuinely going through the democratic process that we've talked about just now, set that tall building policy, and it doesn't produce tall buildings, it produces high density, low rise development and so on, is that it? That's that then?
I think we would consider it as part of their local plan conformity once they've set those out, whether we'd have a discussion with them at that point about whether we think it's appropriate at that stage, and we put comments
whether they've gone through the process rather than what the outcome is.
Even though 3.81 seems to suggest that tall buildings are going to make optimal use of the capacity of sites, which is already another of these justification things that will be pulled out by developers. I have to say I'm incredibly disappointed in this. The one strategic thing that the previous mayor and the previous mayor to that failed in was having a strategic approach to tall buildings in London, because it's the one thing, the skyline, which is shared by all, and as Sunad has said, stretches beyond borough boundaries. So to actually say there are all these things we'd like you to take account of, but we're actually going to leave it to you. And of course there is a duty to consult, which of course is not a duty to agree. So you will have boroughs on either side of boundaries, rivers or whatever, with different approaches, which has already existed and has not been, in a sense, there hasn't been a solution to it. Within here, even if you took just one thing, World Heritage Sites. World Heritage Sites, they are the responsibility of, in a sense, strategically the mayor, although he is saying that he thinks it's been passed across to local authorities. But because World Heritage Sites are held by him, and he actually says they must preserve the outstanding universal value, then surely even in that one area, there ought to be a policy by the mayor that says, and therefore there should be cordons sanitaires, boundary zones, buffer zones, whatever it is, there should be actually height thresholds, which makes it absolutely clear to developers what we can and can't, in a sense, get away with in those particular sites. After all, there's few enough of them, but we are seeing things like Chiswick Curve with the impact on the World Heritage Site of Kew. We're seeing applications in Greenwich, with reference there, and various other ones. So this is tall buildings is a strategic issue. It's not to say that the local councils don't have a response. But there needs to be something which actually looks fundamentally across the piece.
So tall buildings. So tall buildings mean different things in different places, and obviously, and so the definition is up to the borough to define. Because I think if the definition of a tall building in the city would be very different from someone in suburban London, and thus.
Well, it's different because the mayor's made it different, isn't it? It's 150 versus 30 or 25 by the river.
Or less out in outer London, very different.
So you're taking away the thresholds?
No. What we're saying is it wouldn't be possible to identify every single site where a tall building might be appropriate if we could choose a 30-metre height limit and say, okay, is it the mayor's responsibility to identify every single place where it isn't appropriate in their strategic document? We think that's just not practical. We said it's the role of the borough. They need to go through the processes of policy D2 to understand the character, what's valued about the area, to identify where those areas are. The mayor wouldn't know. That's an awful lot of work to do, and also it's not going to be the role of the strategic authority to identify every single tall building site in London.
He's been
but we do have
in terms of non-strategic matters.
He does have. When those conversations are taking place, we are part of them. But what we're saying is we're not leading those conversations. It's for the boroughs to lead those conversations. And a tall building in outer London could be 8 stories high, or less, or whatever considered. Which is completely different to inner London. And so
we're setting out very.
Are you happy if Richmond says a tall building is 5 stories?
Well, we'd have to look at what was in the context of that particular place, and that's why they would identify it. And as our conversation with them would be about, what's appropriate, and each borough will have different height, different heights in different places.
This is a very serious comment because there are areas, whether it's Richmond, Harrow, wherever, where people's concept of tall building is 6, 7, 8 stories probably. And this is something we need to take into account. Now, is this realistically going to happen? And moving on to the next question, which I think is actually an interesting comment taken from Mayor's City for All Londoners, where the Mayor has stressed the need for Londoners to feel comfortable with tall buildings. Question is, yes, great, I want to see that happen. What I'd say, easily said than done, because how do you achieve? I will find it very difficult for my constituents to feel comfortable with tall buildings. How are you actually going to make it happen?
I don't think we're saying that they have to be comfortable with tall buildings. What we're trying to do is set up a process where the scale of development that's going to happen in a borough is plan-led. It's done at the planning stage when the local population are involved and then have been involved in that process, rather than just leaving it to the application stage.
That's true, but when is that going? There's a long way between today and that date when everybody has that in place. And the fact is that for the time being, we just have the development control process we have. It is case by case. And the reason for the number 11 here is actually, and it's recognised partly in this document because there are additional scrutiny given to taller buildings. The taller the building is, more scrutiny. But is there some additional, quite recognisable and precise test that tall buildings need to go through? And the one proposed here is that if there's a tall building proposal, you should always have an alternative proposal which shows how the same outcomes, and these are not land price outcomes, these are, if you like, mayoral priority outcomes or public good outcomes, could be achieved with a lower, say, perimeter block or so on. Recognising, of course, that they will only deliver up to certain density, but then that's inevitable. So why not put a test before a tall building proposal can be considered, that other ways of achieving the true goals of the plan and the local authority have been properly tabled, and so you always have to have an alternative. It could be this or that, and they're both actually,
or that we have gone through the whole process of looking at different forms of development, and the right solution is, in this instance, having gone through different considerations, is a tall building. Unless that happens, they're not going to be able to convince.
That's exactly what the policy says. to do. That's exactly what the policy is saying to do.
Could you
well, the
read
first
it
bit,
together?
the tall buildings one goes through them doing it in that plan-led approach. The design policy has that clause about the alternative solutions to anything, and so that's all. What you're asking is there. Well, I think I said at the beginning when you asked the question.
What's the design policy?
Unfortunately, the tall building section does not come across. It does not tell us that full story, and that is something that needs to happen.
And I
Cross-reference.
Yeah, and I think I said when you first asked the question, we're quite happy to put that reference in, so to make that link stronger. Even, we recognise the plan is a whole plan.
Can you say what that link is to where?
We in terms of the alternative options, in terms of built form, that we expect you to work through and figure out the most appropriate form. That's D2B. And also it's in the housing policy, but that's obviously aimed at housing developments. But the idea is that obviously you've identified where tall buildings are acceptable in principle. So they're going to be little locations all over London. The borough has to do that work to identify that. So you should be reassured that, in a sense, when you do get a proposal for a tall building in one of those locations, the groundwork would be done in terms of it's in principle acceptable. So that would have helped, and the local population would have been involved in that plan making process. So it's a lot more rigorous than the current approach at the moment, where boroughs don't, or they have huge swathes of their borough just given a designation of sensitive to tall buildings, which doesn't mean anything to anyone really, in terms of a developer comes somewhere and says, I'm going to argue to put a tall building here. The local population have no idea where that's going to go. And it is left to discussions at the application stage then. So this is trying to say, tell us where these are going to be in the first place.
Sorry, can you take us through where it is where this alternative is in the policy? It's in D2B, say.
So that process of D2B, you would
D2B is actually determining capacity for growth. It's not actually. It's in advance. It's actually setting the borough-wide policies and so on. But then when you get a single developer coming in the interim forward with a site and a design, what do you do with that?
And that's why we said we will put the link, the cross-reference in.
We will put the cross-reference say that even in the absence of, so for example, until such a time as the local plan has a tall building policy, then any proposal being brought forward on a site must conform to the test of alternatives as set out.
Conform to the test is probably not quite what
we
would work, but we would look at different design solutions. And D2, as soon as the plan has got weight, D2 applies anyway to it.
A consistent thing, Sinan, a consistent thing that's come out of a lot of these issues is the need for the fundamental decisions to engage the public, to be made earlier upstream, to be more transparent, to be more open. And for me, in relation to tall buildings, something that's mentioned in the plan that would hugely help on this front is 3.8.3, the strategic overview of tall building locations using 3D modelling. And that is somewhere. So 3.8.3. It's not in a box. But
page 130.
Sorry, 130. Page 130. 3.8.3 talks about using 3D virtual reality modelling to help assess cumulative impacts to developments, and the mayor will work with boroughs to provide strategic overview of tall building locations across London. Will seek to utilise 3D modelling to help identify these areas, assess tall building proposals, and aid public consultation and engagement, which all sounds great. And would be massively valuable also at looking beyond borough boundaries and assessing cumulative impact on the horizon.
Can I just say, why isn't it in a box?
And that was going to be my question. I was just saying, it could be quite frustrating, having that capacity, that tool, that actually does help Londoners engage in the cumulative impact of development and see what's coming in the pipeline, but not have a box to be able to, for the mayor to be able to then use that as a tool to influence and shape development.
See, I think the mayor... A lot of these boxes don't say anything about the mayor's role. They're all about what the borough should do. And I honestly think the mayor needs to put himself in, give himself a role now and then. Especially here.
Thank you. And I'd just
following on Westminster to decide the world.
Following on from a couple of those points, I mean, I think in D8, the tall buildings policy, as in Good Growth 1, I was very disappointed although there was talk about optimisation, actually all the evidence that was adduced was about the good things about tall buildings and the good things about density, which exist, but not on the other side. And there's, particularly in our climate, it's very good evidence that, on the whole, historically, actually they haven't been as good for residents, particularly for poorer residents. When they do work, it tends to lead to quite a segregated city because of the high running costs and types of, the platonic ideal of a tower block resident is often I'm obviously simplifying ridiculously here, the rich, childless second homeowner. That's the sort of platonic ideal. You can have other towers that work in other ways, but they're the ones that tend to work best as an investment. It isn't a good way to build a integrated city, we'd certainly strongly argue. So it felt to me that intellectually the plan at D8, as in Good Growth 1, was unreasonably lopsided, and that would have consequences. And we're currently looking at your lower threshold numbers in policy B1, and we're currently doing some modelling which isn't yet finished on what some of the implications of the plan would be in some of the current opportunity areas or commercial areas, and the pressure on density is going to be very high. So I think it's very hard to not imagine that this plan, particularly as you put so much pressure on the boroughs, will certainly in the medium term, don't know about the long term, lead to increased pressure for tall buildings. In some places that would be the right thing, but I think the problem there is that tall buildings are a very good way of stopping people supporting development. So in all our polling, and without exception, in London, you can get very strong support for development up to about 6, 7, 8, 9 stories, and then it tends to collapse to a residual about 10% of people who don't mind them. And that's fine, that 10% should be catered to, but so should the other 80, 90%. And I think if some of the other points in the plan, if you mean it, about the London typologies and the design codes, I think you need to get on the front foot. I don't think you can leave it to the boroughs and say, when we say high density London typologies, here, and work it up with communities, not just with architects, which I like architects, and come up with some ones and say, look, here we can get to something that is, and we find ourselves doing this, it pushes a bit beyond the North Kensington, typology into a more Parisian or Belgian or Brussels typology, and you're getting up to 250, 260, 270 homes per hectare. And look, we can make that work, and then get polling on it. Bring the plan to life for people, get out there, get people responding to them. And really, because otherwise I think this will just get eaten alive, or bits of it.
That is exactly what the housing design guidance is going to do. It's going to look at a range of typologies across London to show this is what we really mean in these types of areas. One, to help some of the boroughs that might not have quite got there yet as well. But exactly what you're saying, so we're talking about higher density, particularly a bit more emphasis in outer London. So we're not talking about the massive tower blocks out in outer London. We're talking about 5, 6 stories.
And then bring that to light. I probably flippantly use the phrase.
Be saying just outer London. It may be utterly inappropriate in inner London as well. And that's that is the difficulty, because it talks about opportunity sites being the first site. It talks about being near railway stations, so what? So all the listed railway stations and the listed properties that are adjacent and the conservation areas, therefore, it would suggest are going to be potentially the right site for tall buildings, because in your 3.81, you talk about the fact that tall buildings, particularly in order to make optimal use of the capacity of the site. Now, I know it's not maximum, but it is suggesting that, in a sense, there's a positive cast for all the discussion about tall buildings practically all the way through. Absolutely. And I think that is quite difficult. And I would just make one point as well, which is I would hope that somewhere the mayor might say something about advertisements. There's a brief mention of lighting on buildings, but one of the distinctive things about London is that it doesn't, apart from the creeping bits in Canary Wharf, have adverts all over the top of these buildings to make the 460 that are coming up the pipeline even worse in terms of their impact. So it would be worthwhile having something about that, basically saying it's not on.
Can I ask a quick question just about research? Have you done are there metrics about how much of the required capacity of London will actually be met, housing capacity, housing need, be met through tall buildings? Because the impression is that actually it's a very small, that tall buildings aren't about solving the housing problem. No. So what are they about? So that's
what are they for?
Well, the assessment we've done on capacity, it's all published on our website and assumes a range of densities that are not too far off the current density matrix, but in opportunity areas we are reliant on for those assumptions on development that's above the density ranges as they exist at the moment.
In opportunity areas
only in opportunity areas, marginally so. They go up to a maximum of about 450 dwelling per hectare, and that's in the very higher PTAL opportunity areas. And that's
50 per hectare.
but that's the maximum that we assume, and then boroughs look at those assumptions, and we have more of a sort of detailed discussion about the design implications for each individual large site that we look at. But the basis of that is that's what we've been delivering in opportunity areas. So when we did the SHLA process, this is all discussed in the methodology chapter of the SHLA. We've used those assumptions because they, in our view, give a better understanding of what's being delivered.
So are you saying outside opportunity areas, not much of your housing is likely to be produced through tall buildings?
We don't make any assumption about the typology.
That's the impression.
And we're not reliant on the delivery of tall buildings to meet the as we've said in all the documents in the SHLA itself, you can achieve the same density, like 300 or 200 dwelling per hectare in many different built forms. And we've given some examples of that in our SHLA methodology that we've sort of, Michael's been involved in.
Will that be prescribed in any way? Because one of the things that worries me from my good old days from the GLC is that a policy was adopted whereby a moratorium was put on housing families and affordable housing within tower blocks. That existed until 10 to 15 years ago when it was overturned. And it worries me that we're going to be making the same mistakes through pressure on housing again without dealing with this as well as we could do. The second thing that worries me is the use of good design to mask what is basically an unacceptable scheme. We have the current issue with Zaha Hadid's building in Vauxhall bus station, where we have a very, very high, much higher than was granted previously, building going up, but it's going to be an iconic building. It's going to be good design. To what degree can we mask something that is possibly not popular with a lot of the population on the basis that it is good design? I mean, you do refer to good design. You do refer to this as being the means whereby something will be acceptable.
So we're talking about the support for tall buildings. In the first paragraph, we also point out the weaknesses and sort of the dangers of tall buildings if they're in the wrong location and if they're poor design. But the idea with the policy, in addition to the other design policies, is it gives a lot of detail about what we're expecting for when you do an assessment of a tall building, which is a lot more detailed than our current approach. So the intention is that the buildings would go through much more rigorous scrutiny.
I think that's welcome. And again, like everybody else has said, I'm not far from being against tall buildings. We design tall buildings, but there is clearly a problem because something has happened in this city that nobody expected. Yeah. And it wasn't planned. There was no strategy behind it. It happened, and people are worried about it happening again.
Can I bring us back?
We want that lesson learned, so that we do not get the same mistakes in opportunity areas, whether they are in outer London or in London, and indeed even Bulldog Common MDC area, because that in fact is a great opportunity to set the new London plan vision.
Just before Elliot comes in on that, we recognise that point as well, and I think we've strengthened the opportunity area policy to bring more emphasis to working them up with communities and stakeholders, because we do recognise, in the past that hasn't been as strong as it could be. That's one of the reasons why we're trying to put much more emphasis on design, particularly in those areas, and bringing communities on board with it as well.
Yeah. So I think the existing tall building policy in the sort of the earlier plan actually identified town centres, opportunity areas, railways as where they should go, almost giving the impression that actually they should be generally considered acceptable in those places to start with. We're not saying that anymore in here. In the policy, we're saying that you need to have done. It may be appropriate into an opportunity area or a town centre, but it might not be. You need to have done the work to figure that out in terms of assessing what's the appropriate form and scale. So I think actually we're taking a quite different approach to tall buildings.
In your criteria, thinking it through, what you talk about is you should be actually looking in the environs to see what there is. So let's say crudely, Nine Elms, which of course impacts on a World Heritage Site, so according to this you'd think maybe it shouldn't be being carried on. And yet, because you're looking at an environment which has already got planning permissions, some in the pipeline and some built, way over what was originally expected, the suggestion, in a sense, inbuilt in that is because there's already tower blocks there, there's going to be more because already the environment has changed. But in planning terms, what we used to look at was that if you made a mistake, let's just say simply adverse in the past, and you let rip and you let a whole pile of stuff go through, that even at inspector level, if the applicant said, but there's 10 more down the street and I'm now being refused, the inspector would say no, it's quite right for them to say we made mistakes in the past and now our new approach is going to be this and we will try and eventually clear out the mistakes that we've made. So I am concerned that the way you actually look through your, whatever, I can never remember the numbers, but you know, you start at that front end to decide what you're going to look at. You actually look at the environment. I think you actually have to think about, have you made mistakes with the environment, and therefore do you want to move back from it, albeit that there are some there. Because occasionally, like the Three Sisters at the DOE, no one expected them to go, and yet what an improvement they have made for the people of Lambeth looking across past the World Heritage Sites, because they're no longer there in the skyline.
Can I go back, please, to something which you said, which I believe to be definitive, and I want to make a note of it, which related, I think you suggested, that tall building could be 5 or 6 stories high, whereas I note that in your tall building strategy, you say that outside the Thames policy area and outside the city, a tall building is 10-storey plus. Now, what is right?
So we're saying the borough should define it in their local plan, so it's up to them based on local context. What those thresholds are not ours. That's actually in the GLA Act, the 2007 Act, for what's referable to the mayor. And it uses a height threshold. So that it defines...
Can you clarify, there's a huge difference between a notification criteria and a policy.
Yeah.
It does not have anything to do with the policy.
Exactly.
So we're not. So that's why we're saying that it's up to the borough.
And you might say that the reason that they were referred to the mayor in the first place, because they thought the mayor might look after the, let's say, the Thames. In fact, he didn't. And
Are we talking about the previous?
well, yeah, previous mayors, but any mayor actually, any mayor.
Referred to the mayor to make sure we didn't get the canyon.
Yeah, and I think we're trying to make the distinction. Those things are there about what comes to us here, but what we're saying about what is a tall building is down to the borough's definition of choosing, you know, looking at the context, and they're just different things.
So when will the mayor call them in then? Not call them in, but they won't be referred to the mayor in that case then.
No, but these policies will be applied as part of the development plan, and they apply to those boroughs. And when their borough plans come in, they have to go through a general conformity test, which we will be much more stringently looking at how their policies, you know, take on board.
So the policy would apply in a borough. Say you chose a 6-7-storey building as your tall building definition for a particular area of a borough. Then, so if you get an application for a 7-storey building, you should use this policy to assess it. Although the mayor won't see it because it will be below his threshold.
So the thresholds still exist?
Yes, they're legal thresholds. We don't change them. Yeah.
But it does seem to me, and I go back to a point that one of our experts raised, it does appear that there is going to be open season on places where there are, I think the previous mayor called them clusters, where if those clusters already exist, particularly if it's near a transport hub, it's going to go through on the nod, a tall building. Isn't that right?
No, I think...
Well, your small sites policy effectively says that you're going to increase densities on the small sites. Very often, the small sites might well be near a railway station.
And if it's appropriate, and it goes through a design process and is considered appropriate, then...
The small site policy is limited to 25 homes, so it's unlikely to have... I know that's
very thin tower.
In some contexts, you can, yeah, but other policies would prohibit it.
We're winding up now.
50 stories of stacked mezzanines all the way up.
We're going to have last words now. I mean, are there people who really want to make a point on tall buildings?
So I'd like to say this one that was raised before about in the city for all Londoners, the mayor stressed that the community needed to feel comfortable with it. I don't find the context bit in here, the neighbourhood context. I mean, we've got some hard ones about long-range views, mid-range views, immediate views, but it's not just about views. It's actually about the impact on the community, and I don't find that there.
Yes, okay.
That's very important, because you will recall the mistake that there was made with regard to the strategic view from King Henry's Mound. When that was first set up, it related to the corridor in front of St Paul's, and when buildings were put behind St Paul's, they interfered with the view, which I'm quite afraid was really rather short-sighted of the planners. And I feel a bit guilty about that myself. At the time I was involved.
Comes to the mayor.
And it is. It really goes back to the point, I'm afraid, which you made, which said that something along the lines of, well, a tall building is going to affect a large area in relation to the strategic views. Am I right that the strategic view strategy is unaltered?
The list of strategic views in the plan is the same. We'll be reviewing the actual document. It's a supplementary planning document that has all the detail. We're going to be updating that, following the evidence base that we've collected. We've reviewed every single view, and there's 60 odd viewpoints that have been assessed.
Yes.
So,
and are you going to do that in relation to I think, which was universally accepted to be an error in assessing the King Henry's Mound view?
Absolutely. We're already starting work on that. We've been working and talking to some boroughs initially about some different proposal about extending those background consultation areas to stop this exact thing happening in the future.
We've already done that.
Can I?
That was
I'm
in the
going to have
2011
to. If there are no,
plan, it's in here.
how are we doing on points? I want to make one final point, picking up from Elspeth, which is about when she was talking about the moratorium on, was it a moratorium on tall buildings with families?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, because I am very concerned that we should have some sort of policy about the larger flats, the family-sized flats, for people with young children being on the lower floors, so that people with children can have oversight of them playing and so on. Because there's plenty of evidence now that if you grow children up in tall buildings, and they don't have the ability to go out and play independently, and they don't have social interaction, there are issues and problems. And we shouldn't really be condemning people to be families and children to be high in tall buildings. So I wondered if that's something we could take on board.
If I may, Madam Chair, this is now quite old data, but when I looked at the previous census, we haven't looked back at 2011, it wasn't available when I did the research, you could see a massive disconnect between people in market housing with children living at the second or the fifth floor and above, and people in affordable housing or social housing. And you could see a real disconnect between what people were choosing to do, who could afford to choose, and people who couldn't afford to choose in the same way. And we kept meaning to go back to that and see what's happened. I suspect, if anything, it's got worse over the last few years.
We learnt the lesson from the 60s and 70s. I had to pick up the pieces. I want to... it's hard. There's a lot here, isn't there? But anyway, thank you all for your stamina and for your expertise. It is 500 pages. It is very difficult to get your head around it because it's holistic, and as we've learned, policies are in different places. I think you've been amazing in terms of responding to all our requests. Thank you. And we hope that some of these will be taken on board, and that we'll collect what you've given us, experts, and we'll be putting it into our response to the Mayor and then to the Government Inspector. So thank you all very much, and please write in if you have other things you want us to take on board. Please. Thank you, everyone.
Yes.